being of impossible creation walked among the stars, bearing the burden of 10,000 years upon shoulders that had been forged in the fires of the Emperor's will. Roboute Guilliman was more than a man, more than even a Primarch. He was a living embodiment of vision and order in a galaxy drowning in chaos. His story was not one of glorious triumph or uncomplicated heroism, but of a figure haunted by the knowledge that even the greatest intellect could not prevent the slow decay of civilizations built upon the shoulders of flawed humanity. This is the tale of his rise, his fall, his long sleep, and his resurrection into a future he could scarcely have imagined, a future where the greatest victory might be nothing more than survival itself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. The Child of Prophecy. In the cold reaches beyond the Great Rift, where the void stretched empty and infinite. A single pod pierced the veil between worlds. The vessel was ancient beyond measure, its hull scarred by the journey through the warp, its interior dark save for the faint glow of failing indicator lights that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Within that pod lay Robert Guilliman, the greatest son of the Emperor, consciousness stirring from an abyss older than civilizations. His eyes opened to darkness, and for a moment there was nothing but the slow, measured breathing of a being returning from the precipice of true death. The recycled air tasted of copper, and the ozone tang of overloaded electronics. These were the smells of ending, of a final journey through the void, of arrival at a world he did not yet know. Guilliman's hands moved with deliberate precision, muscular beyond the comprehension of baseline humanity, his fingers brushing against the frost-covered panels of his life pod. The cold metal bit into his enhanced flesh as consciousness fully reasserted itself, bringing with it the crushing weight of memory. 10,000 years. 10,000 years of dreamless sleep, and the Imperium still stood. Or did it? The pod's hatch groaned open, seals breaking with the hiss of pressurized air escaping into the void. Before him lay the observation window, a transparency that looked out upon the world that had been his home, his foundation, his first victory. Macragge hung before him like a jewel caught in the starlight, and yet something was profoundly wrong with it. The world was scarred. Vast swathes of what had once been habitable land now lay blackened and lifeless, the scars of warfare written across its surface in devastation that spoke of centuries of conflict. The orbital defences that should have risen to protect the birthplace of the Ultramarines were silent, their towers dark and crumbling. Guilliman's jaw tightened, muscles tensing beneath pale skin marked with the sigils of his legion. A sound broke through his dark contemplation. A chime, mechanical and insistent, the warning beacon of a dying vessel registering its proximity to a planetary body. The pod systems were failing, had been failing for years uncounted. This descent was no gentle journey, but a race against entropy itself. Guilliman moved with the grace of something far more than human, his enhanced physiology responding to the demands placed upon it, even as dormancy clung to his limbs like chains. He forced himself to stand, muscles protesting against gravity after so long without weight, and made his way to the pod's control terminal. The displays before him were ancient even by the standards of the Dark Imperium, their readouts giving him a fragmented picture of a galaxy grown old and tired in his absence. Scanning the atmosphere, searching for any sign of friendly forces, any indication that the Imperium yet possessed the knowledge to recognize what was descending through its skies. The sensors caught echoes of movement in the orbital space above Macragge, military vessels deploying to intercept. Good. At least some remnant of humanity's military might yet functioned, but those signatures were wrong. The drive patterns were inefficient, suggesting propulsion technology centuries removed from what he remembered. The weapons configurations were unfamiliar, cobbled together designs that spoke of a civilization struggling to maintain knowledge rather than advance it. The empire he had left behind, the glorious pinnacle of human achievement that he had fought to protect, had not merely declined, it had calcified. The pod shuddered violently as it struck the outer atmosphere. Ablative plating burned away in streaks of brilliant white fire, the friction of entry singing against the hull with a sound like the world itself screaming in protest. Guilliman braced himself, his superhuman reflexes tracking the pod's tumbling descent through the atmosphere, calculating trajectories with the same precision he had once used to plan the reduction of enemy worlds. The ground rushed toward him with inexorable momentum. The pod's landing systems, dormant for so long, engaged with stuttering reluctance. Retro thrusters fired, burning with the last of their fuel reserves, attempting to slow the vessel's final approach. It was not enough. The impact came like the fist of an angry god, and the world became chaos. The pod struck the Earth with tremendous force, ploughing through ancient rock formations before coming to rest in a crater of its own making, embedded deep within Macragge's tortured surface. For a moment there was only silence. Then, within the wreckage of the pod, a figure stirred. Guilliman raised himself from the impact-absorbing gel of the stasis chamber, its surface cracking away from his enhanced form like ice breaking in spring. His uniform, magnificent armour of sapphire and gold hung about him in tatters, scorched by the violence of re-entry. He stood slowly, each movement deliberate and assessing, taking in the reality of his surroundings. The pod's walls were hot to the touch, metal warped and smoking from the heat of atmosphere friction. Around him, the various systems that had sustained him during his long sleep began to fail, circuits overloading, emergency lights flickering between red and darkness. Guilliman moved toward the hatch controls, his massive frame filling the cramped interior of the pod entirely. He pressed the mechanism and it fought against him at first, seized by corrosion and the immense pressures of impact. His hand, strong enough to crush ceramite, applied force with careful precision until the hatch groaned open. The world before him was one of devastation. The landing site was surrounded by the ruins of what must once have been a great city, its towers reduced to jagged stumps, its streets lost beneath centuries of dust and decay. The sky above was a sickly grey, heavy clouds obscuring the sun, and through the haze came the distant sound of screaming engines and weapons fire. Guilliman stepped out of the pod, his boots crunching on soil that had not known the touch of his legion in 10,000 years. The air was thick with ash and the acrid taste of chemical weapons, old and new. His enhanced senses detected contamination in every breath, toxins that would kill an unmodified human within hours. A roar echoed across the ruins, followed by the distinctive sound of Astartes' weaponry. Guilliman's lips curved in something that might have been a smile, though there was no humour in it. The Space Marines yet fought. Discipline at least had survived his long absence. But as he moved toward the sound of conflict, Guilliman carried with him the crushing knowledge of what he had learned during those final moments of consciousness. The Imperium had endured. Against all odds, humanity still held the galaxy, still fought against the darkness, and yet in that survival something essential had been lost. The Golden Age had ended, and only ruins remained. Chapter 2. The Imperium Campaign. The sun hung low over the vast plains of northern Macragge, casting long shadows across the sprawling encampment that stretched before Robert Guilliman like a city of canvas and steel. He stood upon a rise, his enhanced eyes tracking the movements of thousands of soldiers as they prepared for what would be the defining campaign of his young life. The wind carried the smell of cook fires, leather, and the metallic scent of weapons being maintained with meticulous care. These were the smells of an army in its prime, disciplined and ready for war. Guilliman's hands rested lightly upon the pommel of his sword, the leather worn smooth by his grip, the blade itself unmarked by rust or neglect. His armour, still bearing the simple markings of Macragge's military hierarchy, seemed to contain barely restrained power within its burnished plates. Around him, the generals and commanders of Macragge's armed forces moved with the careful deference of men in the presence of something beyond their comprehension, though none among them would have dared speak such thoughts aloud. The northern territories had grown wild. The tribes of Imperium, humans who had rejected Macragge's ordered civilization, had begun a series of raids that threatened the stability of the entire world. They were fierce, unpredictable, and utterly resistant to the conventional military strategies that Macragge's generals had thus far attempted to employ against them. 3 campaigns had failed. Hundreds of soldiers lay dead or scattered across the northern wastes, and the Illyrians only grew bolder. Consul Conor, Guilliman's adoptive father had made the decision that would change everything. The young man would lead the fourth campaign. There had been objections, of course. Roboute was only in his early 20s, far too young by conventional standards to command an army. But Connell had seen what others could not yet perceive, the vast intellect that dwelt behind those calm blue eyes, the strategic mind that seemed to perceive patterns and possibilities where others saw only chaos. General Marvin Valk approached, his weathered face bearing the marks of decades spent in military service. His green eyes, though dimmed by age, still held the sharp focus of a soldier who understood the realities of warfare. He moved with the careful respect of a man approaching something he could not quite classify. "Young strategist," Valk began, his voice carrying the formal tones used when addressing Macragge's nobility. "We have prepared the forces as you requested. The cavalry regiments are positioned on the eastern flank, numbering 12,000 strong. The heavy infantry forms our centre, 30,000 armed with pike and sword. The archers and lighter troops hold the western position, another 8,000 ready to harry enemy movements." Guilliman nodded slowly, absorbing the information without the sense of overwhelming responsibility that such numbers might have inspired in an ordinary commander. His mind calculated firing solutions, supply line capacities, and tactical response patterns with the ease of a naturally gifted strategist. "Show me the scouting reports," he said simply. Valk produced a worn map, its surface marked with notations indicating Illyrian positions, movement patterns, and estimated force strengths. The general spread it across a campaign table, its surface scarred by the wear of countless previous wars. Guilliman leaned forward, his enhanced eyes scanning the details with a precision that made Valk feel oddly exposed in the presence of such focused intellect. His finger traced the terrain, following valleys and ridgelines with the certainty of one who could see far more than the marks upon parchment could convey. "The Illyrians expect a frontal assault," he said after a long moment of silence. "They have positioned their warriors in the narrow valleys of the Kelder Pass, where our numerical superiority becomes meaningless. The rough terrain favours their knowledge of the land, their ability to ambush and withdraw. Your previous commanders made the mistake of meeting them on ground of their choosing." He paused, stepping back from the map with a calm that seemed almost indifferent to the weight of the moment. "That will change." Valk felt a chill run down his spine at the certainty in Guilliman's voice, the absolute confidence of a being for whom failure seemed almost incomprehensible. "What do you propose, my lord?" The general ventured carefully. Guilliman turned to face him, and in that moment Valk understood why Consul Kona had chosen this young man. There was something in those eyes that transcended mere intelligence, a quality of absolute conviction that carried the weight of destiny. "We do not attack the Kelder Pass. Instead, we split our forces. The main army appears to advance directly toward the pass, slowly, methodically, exactly as the Illyrians expect. But the cavalry regiments will swing wide, moving through the southern routes, terrain that scouting suggests is difficult but passable." He traced the new route with his finger, moving across the map with the precision of one who could visualize distance and terrain with perfect clarity. "We will encircle their position, cutting off retreat, establishing supply lines, and creating a corridor of escape to the west that we can then collapse at the moment of their attempt to use it. But more importantly," Guilliman continued, "we will offer them terms." The tone of his voice shifted slightly, carrying notes of something that might have been compassion, a quality that Valk had not expected to find in a military commander, barely old enough to grow a beard. "The Illyrians fight because they fear absorption into Macragge's civilization. They see our order as oppression. Some of that perception is not without merit. We will offer them autonomy within a broader framework, local governance, maintenance of their cultural traditions, in exchange for cessation of raids and acknowledgement of Macragge's ultimate sovereignty." General Valk's weathered face reflected doubt and confusion in equal measure. "With respect, my lord, the Illyrians have shown no interest in negotiation during previous campaigns. They view us as conquerors seeking their subjugation. Then we demonstrate through action that we are different," Guilliman replied calmly. "We will not slaughter them. We will not burn their settlements. We will contain their military forces, prove the futility of resistance, and then offer them a future where they are not destroyed but integrated. Respect, I have learned, is earned not merely through strength, but through the clarity of one's purposes and the consistency of one's actions." The campaign began at dawn. and from the outset it bore the unmistakable hallmarks of a mind operating on a level far beyond ordinary military strategy. The diversionary force moved against the Kelder Pass with carefully controlled aggression, engaging the Illyrian warriors without committing to full battle. They would advance, withdraw, advance again, drawing the tribal fighters into a pattern of engagement that slowly consumed their reserves of strength and ammunition. Meanwhile, the cavalry swept through the southern routes, their movements coordinated with a precision that seemed almost miraculous given the difficult terrain. Guilliman rode with them, his massive frame somehow fitting gracefully upon a specially reinforced horse, his presence seeming to inspire confidence in the soldiers around him despite his youth. Days turned into weeks. The Illyrian warriors, accustomed to quick raids and swift retreats, found themselves facing a war of attrition against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited patience and resources. Supply lines began to falter, casualties mounted, and slowly, inexorably, the Illyrian position became untenable. When the moment came, when the tribe saw that their encirclement was complete, Guilliman did not order the final assault. Instead, he rode to the diplomatic pavilion, bearing a white banner and accompanied only by a small honour guard. General Valk watched from a distance, sceptical, and yet unable to look away. The Illyrian leaders emerged from their defensive positions, warriors scarred and bloodied from weeks of fighting. They regarded Guilliman with a mixture of hatred and something else, a grudging recognition, perhaps, of an opponent worthy of respect. Guilliman spoke to them as equals, which in the eyes of soldiers is perhaps the greatest honour one can offer. He did not demand their surrender. He offered them something far more valuable, a future, autonomy within Macragge's structure, the preservation of their way of life, provided they ceased the raids that threatened regional stability. It took 3 days of negotiation, but in the end the Illyrian leaders accepted, not because they had grown soft, but because they recognised in Guilliman something rare and precious in military commanders, a being whose word could be trusted, whose promises would be honoured, who saw their people not as obstacles to be eliminated, but as humans to be understood and integrated. When the army returned to Macragge's heartland, they came not with prisoners and slaves, but with the Illyrian tribes marching alongside them, united under a banner that suggested future cooperation rather than continued conflict. The generals whispered among themselves about the impossibility of what they had witnessed, the strategic genius that had resolved in months what should have taken years. Consul Conor stood at the gates of Macragge's primary city, watching as his adopted son rode at the head of the unified forces. The old man's weathered face bore a smile of absolute certainty, the expression of one who had recognised genius and given it the opportunity to flourish. Later, in the privacy of Conor's chambers, the consul placed a hand upon Guilliman's shoulder with a weight that suggested profound satisfaction. "You have done more than win a military campaign," he said quietly. "You have shown this world what it means to be a true leader, not one who merely conquers, but one who builds, one who sees potential where others see only enemies." Guilliman accepted the praise with the quiet dignity that seemed his natural state, but behind his calm exterior something had shifted. The Imperium campaign had confirmed what he had always suspected about himself. He was not merely a soldier, not merely a commander of armies. He was something far greater, though he could not yet put a name to it. The northern territories slowly transformed under his continued oversight. Infrastructure developed. Trade routes opened. The Illyrians, integrated into Macragge's society while maintaining their cultural identity, became some of the realm's most dedicated soldiers and craftspeople. And in the minds of Macragge's population, a legend began to take root. The name Roboute Guilliman became synonymous with victory, yes, but more importantly with a vision of leadership that transcended mere conquest. He was not a tyrant demanding obedience through fear. He was something far more dangerous, a leader who could inspire loyalty through the clarity of his vision and the consistency of his actions. Standing alone upon the same rise where he had surveyed the army before the campaign began, Guilliman gazed out over the transformed northern territories. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across prosperous settlements where disorder had once reigned. His enhanced mind already moved forward, considering the next challenges, the next improvements to Macragge's society and military structure. He did not yet understand the weight of destiny that was beginning to settle upon his shoulders, the certainty that he would one day stand as a Primarch among Primarchs. But in those quiet moments, as evening descended upon Macragge, perhaps some part of him recognized the beginning of something great, something that would echo across 10,000 years and into the desperate present of a dying Imperium. Chapter 3. The Throne of Macragge. The night came swiftly to the capital city of Macragge, darkness descending like a shroud across streets that had known peace for far too long. Robert Guilliman stood upon the observation tower of the Grand Palatine, his enhanced eyes piercing through the gloom with the clarity of perfect vision, watching as the city below began its evening routines. Torches flickered to life along the thoroughfares, casting dancing shadows that reminded him, disturbingly, of the patterns of blood spilling across stone. Something was wrong. The sensation had crept upon him gradually during his campaigns in the Northern Territories, a growing wrongness like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. Messages from the capital had become sparse. Consul Conor's communications had grown strange, filled with oblique references and careful wordings that suggested obstacles he was not being permitted to address directly. Guilliman's hand rested against the cold stone of the tower's parapet, his enhanced senses detecting vibrations in the masonry that spoke of recent construction, emergency fortifications built in secret. Someone was preparing defences within Macragge itself. The realization brought with it a cold clarity that transcended mere intelligence. It was a recognition of betrayal, though the full scope of that betrayal had not yet revealed itself. A messenger arrived at the tower, his movements hurried and nervous. The young soldier bore the insignia of the consul's personal guard, his uniform bearing the purple and gold of Macragge's highest officers. His face was pale, beaded with sweat despite the cool evening air, and his eyes darted constantly toward the doorway as though expecting pursuit at any moment. "My Lord Guilliman," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I come bearing urgent news from Consul Conor. He instructed me to find you immediately away from the palace proper." The tone of the message, its secretive nature, confirmed Guilliman's suspicions that something fundamental had shifted in the political landscape of his home world. "Lead me to him," Guilliman commanded, moving with sudden purpose down the tower stairs. His massive frame seemed to fill the narrow spiral passage entirely, and the messenger struggled to maintain pace with his enhanced stride. Around them, the palace seemed to hold its breath, servants and guards alike shrinking away from the passage of the young lord. The messenger led him through rarely used corridors, passages that spoke of Macragge's ancient history, their walls bearing the scars of centuries past. Finally, they arrived at a hidden chamber deep within the palace's foundations, a place of stone and shadow where few would ever think to look for a consul. Conor awaited him there, and Guilliman's breath caught at the sight of his adoptive father. The man had aged years in the weeks since Guilliman's departure for the Imperium campaign. His face was haggard, his movements stiff with pain, and his eyes held a quality of desperation that Guilliman had never before witnessed. "My son," Conor said, reaching out with a trembling hand, "you must listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. Every moment we spend in conversation is a moment closer to the execution of a plan that will tear Macragge asunder." "Speak freely," Guilliman replied, moving to support his adoptive father as the older man stumbled slightly. "What has transpired in my absence?" "A conspiracy," Conor said heavily, sinking into a chair with apparent relief at being able to finally unburden himself. "Led by Consul Gallen and his faction. They have grown fearful of your popularity among the military forces, your success in the Imperium campaign. They see you as a threat to their power structure, a young upstart who might one day challenge their authority." Gallen had always been a political adversary, a representative of the old guard that clung to Macragge's traditional hierarchies. But Guilliman had not imagined him capable of such direct action. The realization of how blind he had been, how focused upon military victory to the exclusion of political reality, struck him with physical force. "When?" Guilliman demanded. "What is their timeline?" "Tonight," Conor replied, his voice dropping even lower. "They move against me even now, securing control of the palace's military contingents, subverting commanders loyal to my faction. By dawn, they intend to declare me unfit to rule, citing my age and deteriorating health. They will seize control of Macragge and move to neutralize you before you can organize a response." Guilliman's mind moved through the implications with perfect clarity, calculating the political and military realities of the situation with the same precision he brought to battle strategy. The conspiracy was sophisticated, well-planned, and had likely been in development for months. It represented exactly the sort of political calculus that he had not yet fully grasped. The reality that victory in war did not automatically translate to security from political enemies. How many are committed to Gallen's cause, he asked, already planning responses to various scenarios. Approximately 30% of the palace guard, Connor replied. Perhaps 50% of the military commanders, though that number fluctuates based on where each sees the balance of power shifting. The remainder are uncommitted, awaiting developments before declaring openly for one faction or another. Then, we must act before the balance tips irreversibly toward Gallen, Guilliman said with sudden resolution. But not as he expects. He anticipates a military response, a show of force that will drive the uncommitted toward his faction out of fear. Instead, we will give him something far more devastating: the truth. He turned to Connor, his enhanced eyes meeting the older man's gaze with absolute certainty. What evidence do you possess of Gallen's conspiracy? Testimony? Documents? Communications? Connor's weathered face shifted into something approaching a smile, though it carried no humour. I am the consul of Macragge, my son. I have learned, over decades of service, that surviving in positions of power requires careful documentation of one's enemy's movements. Gallen has been remarkably careless in his communications. I possess documents bearing his personal seal, messages that detail the conspiracy in explicit detail, arrangements with military commanders for their switching of allegiance. Then we proceed immediately to the Senate chamber, Guilliman declared. We will convene an emergency session, present the evidence to the assembled nobles and military commanders, and allow the political process to resolve itself. If the people and the military choose Gallen over us, then so be it. But we will not cede the moral high ground by matching conspiracy with military force. But my son, Connor protested weakly, Gallen will likely act violently rather than allow such an assembly to occur. He may move to arrest us before we can reach the Senate. Then we move quickly, and we move openly, Guilliman replied with the calm certainty of one who had faced down armed enemies and emerged victorious. Stealth is his advantage. Transparency is ours. We will gather the evidence you possess, and we will walk through the central streets of this city in full regalia, visible to every citizen, making it impossible for Gallen to act against us without appearing exactly as the tyrant we claim him to be. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, and yet as they emerged from the hidden chamber into the palace's main corridors, Guilliman found that his absolute conviction carried a tangible weight. Servants and guards who witnessed their passage stood aside, seeming to sense that they were witnessing something of profound historical importance. The journey through Macragge's streets was surreal. Word of Guilliman's movement spread ahead of them, whispered from person to person, carried by runners and messengers. By the time they reached the Senate chamber, crowds had begun to gather, drawn by the electricity in the air, the sense that the fabric of their world was being fundamentally rewoven. The Senate chamber was already partially occupied when they arrived. Military commanders gathered in small clusters, their discussions ceasing as Guilliman and Connor entered. Consul Gallen stood at the centre of the assembly, his handsome features twisted with barely concealed rage at the appearance of the two men he had expected to be imprisoned or dead. Connor, he said, his voice carrying the smooth tones of false concern, I am relieved to find you well. There have been reports of your being taken ill. We were gathering to ensure the continuity of Macragge's government in your absence. The lie was transparent, delivered with such assured confidence that it betrayed the speaker's absolute conviction in his own power. Guilliman watched as various commanders shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that something fundamental had shifted. How kind of you to be concerned for my health, Connor replied, moving forward with surprising steadiness despite his physical frailty. Allow me to alleviate your worries by addressing the assembly directly. What followed was a masterclass in political exposure. Connor, with Guilliman's support, laid out the full scope of Gallen's conspiracy. Documents were produced, read aloud, their authenticity verified by the assembly's scribes. Communications between Gallen and subverted military commanders were detailed. The careful planning of a coup d'etat was revealed in its entirety. Gallen attempted to respond, to deny, to threaten, to manipulate, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The uncommitted commanders, faced with clear evidence of conspiracy and confronted by the presence of Guilliman standing beside his adoptive father in absolute calm, began to declare for Connor. Within hours, the political situation had reversed entirely, but the night was not yet over. In the depths of the palace, as confusion and shock rippled through Macragge's political establishment, Gallen made his final desperate move. He would not be taken, would not face trial and likely execution for his conspiracy. Instead, he would attempt one last gambit. He would kill Conor, blame the deed on Guilliman, and use the chaos of the aftermath to seize power through military coup after all. The assassins came in the night, professional killers hired from among Gallen's most loyal followers. They struck at Conor's chambers, swords flashing through the darkness, seeking the blood of a man they believed defenceless and aged. But Guilliman had anticipated this possibility. He was there, waiting in the shadows, his sword moving with a speed and precision that transformed the assassination attempt into a massacre. The killers, professionals and skilled, fell before him like grass before a scythe. They had been trained to fight men. They faced something far beyond that. When the smoke cleared, when the last of the assassins lay dead upon the chamber's cold stone floor, Conor emerged from the protective shield that Guilliman had maintained around him. The old consul's face bore the weight of a terrible realization, the knowledge that despite his careful planning, despite his attempt to preserve the moral high ground, blood had nonetheless been shed in the struggle for Macragge's future. Guilliman held his father as Conor's strength began to fail, the exertion and emotion of the night's events finally overwhelming the old man's failing body. "Poison," Conor whispered, clutching at his adopted son's armour with weakening fingers. Gallen ensured the assassins carried poison on their blades. Poison intended for me, but the blade that carried it struck me as well. "No," Guilliman said, his voice carrying an anguish that transcended mere sadness. The word was a command, an attempt to deny a reality that his enhanced senses made unmistakably clear. The poison was already spreading through Conor's aging system, disrupting the delicate balance that kept him alive. "My son," Conor said, his eyes beginning to lose their focus even as his mind remained sharp. "You must listen to my final counsel. Do not make the mistake of becoming what you feared in Gallen. Do not let the acquisition of power corrupt the principles upon which you built it. Macragge must be a place of order, yes, but order grounded in justice, in fair dealing, in the recognition that all citizens, regardless of station, possess inherent worth and dignity." "I will remember," Guilliman said, knowing even as the words left his lips that he could never fully express what Conor meant to him, the role that this man had played in shaping the being he had become. "Then my death will not be meaningless," Conor replied, his breath becoming shallow. "Build something great, my son. Build something that endures." And then he was gone, his final exhale carrying with it the end of an era and the beginning of another. Gallen was captured before dawn broke. The evidence of his conspiracy, now compounded by his attempted assassination, was overwhelming. He was tried in open assembly, convicted of treason, and executed in the same chamber where he had hoped to seize power. There was no mercy in Guilliman's justice, but neither was there cruelty. It was simply the inevitable consequence of actions freely chosen. In the weeks that followed, Guilliman took control of Macragge not as a usurper, but as the chosen successor of Consul Conor, elevated through both legitimate succession and the clear support of the military and the people. He wore the title of consul as though it had always been meant for him, and under his careful stewardship Macragge began to transform. The lessons learned during the political crisis of Conor's death shaped everything that followed. Guilliman would never again allow military strength to exist in isolation from political savvy. He would build institutions designed to balance power, to prevent the concentration of authority in any single individual's hands, to ensure that justice and fairness formed the foundation upon which all other considerations rested. It was from this foundation that the seeds of the Codex Astartes would eventually grow, though Guilliman did not yet know it. It was from this experience that he learned that true authority derived not from fear or even strength, but from the consistent demonstration of principles applied fairly to all. Standing before Conor's tomb in the days after his death, Guilliman placed a gauntleted hand upon the stone and made a silent vow. He would honour the old consul's memory by becoming the ruler that Macragge needed, and perhaps, in time, becoming something far greater still. What shape that destiny would take he could not yet perceive, but the weight of it was already settling upon his shoulders, preparing him, for the vast responsibilities that awaited. The throne of Macragge was his now, and with it came the terrible clarity that true power was not a prize to be celebrated, but a burden to be borne with precision and care, always mindful of the lives and futures dependent upon the decisions made from positions of authority. Chapter 4. The Arrival of the Emperor. The sky above Macragge had never known such brilliance. The void ships descended through the upper atmosphere like descending stars, their hulls bearing the golden iconography of the Imperium of man, their approach heralded by waves of broadcast energy that announced their arrival across every communication frequency on the planet. Roboute Guilliman stood upon the highest tower of Macragge's primary palace, watching as the vessels positioned themselves in precise orbital formations, their mere presence transforming the political and military landscape of his entire world. News of the Emperor's arrival had preceded the ships by months. Whispers had travelled through the expanding human settlements of the Segmentum Ultima, carried by traders and explorers returning from distant systems. The Emperor walked among his people once more. The Great Crusade had begun, and entire worlds were being brought back into the fold of human civilization after ages of isolation and decay. Guilliman's enhanced senses had tracked every word of those reports with meticulous precision, cataloguing, analysing, attempting to construct a comprehensive understanding of the being who had created him, the father he had never known, the godlike figure whose image adorned temples and shrines throughout Macragge. What he felt in anticipation of this meeting was something he could not quite name, something deeper than mere intellectual curiosity, something that transcended the careful emotional control that had served him so well throughout his life. Tarasha Uten appeared at the tower's entrance, her aged frame moving with the careful precision of one whose body had begun to fail, even as her mind remained sharp. The seneschal bore the weight of her years with dignified acceptance, and her eyes, when they met Guilliman's, carried a warmth that spoke of decades spent guiding the boy toward manhood. "They have requested your presence at the landing site," she said, her voice carrying the practiced tones of one accustomed to delivering official pronouncements. "The Emperor himself has expressed a desire to meet with you personally before conducting any other business on Macragge." The formality of the announcement could not entirely mask the undercurrent of emotion beneath Tarasha's words. She had been the closest thing to a mother that Guilliman had ever known, had shaped his development through careful guidance and consistent affection in the years before Connor's death. The prospect of his meeting with the Emperor represented a threshold moment, a point beyond which his life would transform irrevocably. "Then we proceed to the landing site," Guilliman said, though the words carried less certainty than his usual declarations. He moved to gather his formal regalia, the ceremonial armour of Macragge's ruler, polished to a mirror shine and bearing the insignia of his authority. But as he prepared, he found himself moving with less precision than usual, his enhanced coordination momentarily disrupted by an unfamiliar sense of anticipatory anxiety. The landing site had been selected with care, a broad plain beyond Macragge's primary city, where the massive void ships could deploy their cargo without risk to civilian populations. As Guilliman's motorcade approached, the sheer scale of the Imperial military apparatus became unmistakably apparent. The ships that had seemed impressive in orbit now revealed themselves to be merely the vanguard of a far greater force. Thousands of soldiers moved with military precision across the landing grounds, armed with weapons of a sophistication that made Macragge's finest arms look primitive by comparison. And there, at the centre of it all, stood the Emperor of mankind. Guilliman's breath caught in his throat, a physical reaction that he struggled to suppress. No amount of intellectual preparation could have readied him for the reality of standing before the being who had created him. The Emperor was tall, impossibly so, even more massive than Guilliman's own enhanced frame. He wore armour of gold and white, each surface bearing the marks of countless wars and the unmistakable patina of ages beyond measure. But it was his eyes that held Guilliman's attention, eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone and spirit itself, perceiving truths that existed beyond the normal scope of human understanding. "My son," the Emperor said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through Guilliman's very being, bypassing his ears and registering directly in some deeper centre of consciousness. "I have waited long to look upon you." The words were simple, almost commonplace, yet they carried a weight of meaning that Guilliman's enhanced intellect could only partially grasp. He was aware of soldiers and officers watching, aware of protocol and the necessity of formal response, yet all of that seemed somehow distant and unimportant in the face of this moment. "Father," Guilliman replied, and the word felt strange on his tongue, a designation that he had never expected to use, yet which felt absolutely correct the moment it was spoken. The Emperor's gaze seemed to shift, focusing more intently, and Guilliman sensed that some form of assessment was occurring, a judgment being rendered upon the being standing before him. "Come with me," the Emperor commanded, and Guilliman found himself following, separated from his honour guard and his ceremonial attendants, walking across the landing grounds toward one of the descending passenger craft. Inside the vessel, alone with his creator, Guilliman experienced a moment of vulnerability that he had never anticipated feeling. The Emperor seated himself, and Guilliman could not help but note the perfect natural authority with which he occupied space, the absolute confidence of one for whom failure was not a category that existed in his consciousness. When he spoke, his words came with the weight of revelation. "I created you and your brothers to be tools, yes, but also to be something far greater. I set you upon distant worlds, trusting that you would grow, would develop, would eventually become the champions that humanity would require in its darkest hours. Some have fulfilled that destiny, others have chosen different paths. I have watched you from across the void, Roboute, observed your growth with great satisfaction." Guilliman listened, absorbing every word, understanding on some level that these revelations were shaping something fundamental within him, recontextualizing his entire existence. He was not a child of Macragge, not truly. He was something created for a purpose, shaped by forces and intelligences beyond his complete understanding. "I have come to bring humanity back to unity," the Emperor continued. "Across the galaxy, isolated human worlds have been scattered, cut off from the light of the Imperium. Through the Great Crusade, I will gather them once more, establish order, re-establish the foundations of a civilization that will endure for 10,000 years and beyond. And you, Roboute, will be instrumental in that grand design. I am elevating you to the status of Primarch of the Ultramarines. This legion, currently without a warlord of their own, awaits your command. Under your guidance, they will become the finest warriors that humanity can produce. They will be the standard by which all other military forces are measured, the embodiment of discipline and strategic excellence." The scope of what the Emperor was offering rendered Guilliman momentarily speechless. He had considered himself the ruler of Macragge, the most powerful being on his world, a figure of ultimate authority and military capability. In a single conversation, all of that had been contextualized as merely the prelude to something far greater. "I understand, Father," Guilliman said slowly, finding his voice once more. "I will accept this responsibility. The Ultramarines will become what you envision. But I must ask, what of Macragge? What of the people I have sworn to protect?" The Emperor's gaze shifted, and Guilliman perceived something in that look that might have been approval, or perhaps merely the recognition of a question that he had anticipated. "Macragge will endure," he replied. "Its independence will be preserved, its people incorporated into the broader Imperium not as conquered subjects, but as valued members of a greater whole. You may maintain contact with your world, may ensure its continued development and prosperity. But your primary duty will be to the Ultramarines, and through them, to the vision I am constructing." The parting was both profound and matter-of-fact. The Emperor dismissed Guilliman with a gesture, having conveyed what needed to be conveyed, his attention already shifting toward the next 1,000 concerns that demanded his consciousness. But as Guilliman departed the Emperor's personal chambers, he found that something fundamental had shifted within him. The presentation of the Ultramarines took place 3 days later, in a ceremony that drew the attention of Macragge's entire political and military establishment. The Space Marines arrived in dropships that descended from orbit with thunderous precision, their armour bearing the deep blue and white of the Legion, their bearing unmistakable even to eyes that had never before witnessed genetically enhanced warriors of such calibre. Guilliman stood before them, and they before him, a moment of profound recognition passing between commander and commanded. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the products of genetic enhancement, of indoctrination, of training that would have driven unmodified humans to madness. yet they perceived in Guilliman something that transcended even their extensive programming. They recognized in him a being of equivalent stature, a leader worthy of their absolute loyalty. The senior officers of the Ultramarines approached, bearing the ceremonial trappings of their rank. The highest among them, a massive figure whose armour bore the gold trim of a captain of the Legion, knelt before Guilliman with perfect military discipline. "My Lord Primarch," the captain said, his voice resonating through the vocoder of his armour, "we stand ready to serve. The Ultramarines have awaited your arrival since our inception. We pledge to you our loyalty, our strength and our lives in service to the vision you shall command us to pursue." Guilliman accepted this pledge not with the arrogance that might have seemed appropriate to his newfound station, but with the same careful consideration he brought to all matters of consequence. "Rise, Captain," he commanded. "You and your brothers have been given to me as a gift, as a trust. I will not squander that gift. Together, we will build something that endures, something that transforms the galaxy through strength tempered with wisdom, through military excellence grounded in moral clarity." The transformation was rapid. Within weeks, the Ultramarines' operational structure had been fundamentally restructured, according to principles that Guilliman implemented with meticulous precision. Units were reorganized for maximum efficiency. Training protocols were enhanced with strategies developed from Guilliman's own military experience. Supply chains were optimized. Communications frameworks were rebuilt from the ground up. But beyond the merely functional improvements, Guilliman worked to impart something less tangible to the Space Marines under his command. He taught them that their strength was not merely a physical attribute but a responsibility, that the purpose of military force was not dominion for its own sake, but the establishment of stable orders that would allow civilizations to grow and flourish. In his private communications with the Emperor, transmitted across the vast distances of space via astropathic channels, Guilliman shared his vision for the Ultramarines and the broader Great Crusade. He spoke of worlds that could be brought into the Imperium not through slaughter, but through demonstration of the benefits that unity would bring. He outlined plans for fortifying Ultramar, the broad region of space that the Emperor had designated as the Ultramarine sector of responsibility. The Emperor's responses came infrequently but always carried weight. There was approval for his strategies of integration and careful expansion. But there were also warnings, whispers across the void that not all of Guilliman's brothers had embraced the Emperor's vision with equal enthusiasm. Some legions were beginning to show concerning signs of ideological deviation. Some Primarchs harboured resentments and jealousies that the careful balance of the Great Crusade might not indefinitely contain. In the relative quiet of his flagship, the Macragge, Guilliman studied reports from across the expanding Imperium and contemplated the vast machinery of which he was now a part. He was no longer merely the ruler of Macragge, though that responsibility remained. He was now a Primarch, a son of the Emperor, a creature of war and strategy tasked with bringing order to a fractured galaxy. The golden age of the Imperium seemed limitless in possibility, and yet in the spaces between reports and communications, Guilliman found himself troubled by an intuition he could not fully articulate. Some distant part of his vast intellect perceived shadows moving at the periphery of human space, sensed the fragility that underlay even the most impressive structures of power. But such concerns could wait. For now there was work to be done, worlds to be brought into the light of the Imperium, and a legion of warriors awaiting his command to march forward into the future that the Emperor had promised them. Macragge, watching from the comfort of her homeworld, seemed suddenly very far away. Chapter 5: The Great Crusade and Ultramar. The void stretched eternal before the fleets of the Ultramarines, a canvas of infinite darkness punctuated by distant stars that represented worlds waiting to be reclaimed by human civilization. Robert Guilliman stood upon the bridge of the Macragge, his enhanced eyes tracking the movements of 300 warships arrayed in perfect formation, each vessel a city unto itself, each carrying thousands of space marines and support personnel across the galactic expanse. The rhythmic thrum of plasma drives provided a constant backdrop to his thoughts, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse with the very ambition of the Great Crusade itself. 200 years had passed since his elevation to Primarch, 2 centuries of ceaseless military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and the vast organizational efforts required to bring hundreds of worlds back into the embrace of humanity's reborn empire. Where other Primarchs measured their conquests in the brutal efficiency of overwhelming force, Guilliman had begun to construct something far more complex. He was building not merely a military force, but the foundations of a civilization that could sustain itself across the immeasurable distances of space. The concept of Ultramar had begun as a strategic consideration, a practical recognition that the ultramarine sector of responsibility encompassed a sphere of space too vast for effective central governance from any single world. But it had evolved into something far greater under Guilliman's careful stewardship. 500 worlds now fell under the administrative structure he had established, each incorporated into a network of mutual defense, trade, and cultural exchange that bound them together far more effectively than mere conquest could have accomplished. Captain Titus Havelock entered the bridge with the confident precision that characterized all senior Ultramarines officers. His armor bore the insignia of rank and the scars of 100 worlds, and his aged face, visible through the open faceplate of his helmet, carried the weight of years spent in the service of the Primarch. He approached the command throne where Guilliman stood, his movements precise and respectful. "My lord," the captain said, his voice carrying the practiced formality of one long accustomed to addressing beings of godlike capability. The latest reports from the Calth sector indicate full compliance with the integration protocols. The manufacturing capacity on Grax Prime is now producing bolter ammunition at 3 times the previous rate, and the shipyards on Espandor have completed another 3 strike cruisers. Guilliman nodded slowly, his vast intellect processing the information while simultaneously considering a dozen other factors of strategic importance. The integration of conquered worlds into Ultramar's productive apparatus was proceeding according to projections, perhaps even slightly ahead of schedule, but schedule meant nothing if the underlying infrastructure began to show signs of structural stress. "What of the civilian population movements?" he inquired, turning from the viewport to face Havelock directly. "Are we seeing the expected settlement patterns on the newly opened frontier worlds?" "Largely as predicted, my lord," Havelock replied, consulting a data slate he carried. "The populations on the core worlds are beginning to see the benefits of the expanded trade networks, and reports indicate a growing sense of security among the civilian populace, now that the outer systems are being more effectively patrolled by our fleets. Some of the more conservative populations have expressed concerns about the pace of cultural integration, but nothing suggesting active resistance to Imperial authority." "Good," Guilliman said, turning back to the viewport. "We must never forget that the strength of Ultramar derives not merely from military force, but from the conviction of its population that this union serves their interests. Force can compel obedience, belief compels loyalty, and loyalty, Captain, is far more valuable than mere obedience." The strategic vision that Guilliman had developed for Ultramar represented a fundamental departure from the approaches being taken by some of his brother Primarchs. While Lorgar built temples and demanded religious devotion, while Perturabo constructed fortifications and brooded over perceived slights, while Horus swept through world after world with increasingly aggressive military campaigns, Guilliman constructed systems. He established trade routes that enriched both the core worlds and the newly incorporated territories. He implemented legal codes that were fair and consistent, reducing the likelihood of resistance to Imperial authority. He promoted the development of educational institutions that would produce administrators and technicians capable of maintaining the vast infrastructure that made human civilization possible. He built roads and communication networks that bound disparate worlds together into a functioning whole rather than isolated subject territories. The results were measurable and profound. Ultramar's productivity increased exponentially as worlds that had previously been isolated backwaters began to contribute to a broader economy of scale. Tax revenues, extracted fairly rather than through brutal exploitation, increased dramatically. The number of Space Marines that the Ultramarines could field began to exceed even the projections established by the Emperor's General Staff. Yet Guilliman was not blind to the jealousy and resentment that his success bred among his brothers. During the rare occasions when the Primarchs assembled for great strategic councils, he observed the calculating looks that some cast in his direction. Horus, the War Master himself, had begun to reference Ultramar with a tone that suggested both appreciation and a certain simmering resentment at the fact that Guilliman had managed to accomplish through administrative genius what Horus sought to accomplish through charisma and brute force. The reports that reached Guilliman from his network of informants across the Imperium began to paint a concerning picture. Whispers of discontent among certain of the Primarchs. Suggestions that the Emperor's vision was being interpreted differently by different legion commanders. Indications that the unity which had seemed so absolute during the early years of the Great Crusade was beginning to fracture along fault lines that Guilliman found himself unable to fully comprehend. In the privacy of his personal chambers aboard the Macragge, Guilliman reviewed the most concerning reports, his enhanced mind processing not merely the explicit content of the messages, but the implications they carried. A message from Lorgar suggesting that the Emperor's divinity should be more openly acknowledged among the civilian populations. A report from Kurz indicating increasingly brutal pacification campaigns on worlds that should have submitted peacefully. A cryptic communication from Horus that suggested he was gathering the Primarchs for a great gathering, ostensibly to discuss coordinated strategy, but with undertones that suggested something far more significant was being planned. Guilliman found himself confronted with a realization that transcended mere strategic analysis. He was witnessing the beginning of fractures in the foundation upon which the Emperor had constructed the Great Crusade. The unity that had seemed so absolute, so inevitable, was proving far more fragile than any of them had anticipated. He composed a carefully worded communication to the Emperor, transmitted across the void via astropath, expressing his concerns about the divergence in interpretation of the Emperor's vision among his brothers. The response, when it came weeks later, carried the weight of disappointment mingled with a kind of resigned acknowledgement. "Your concerns are not without merit," the Emperor's message conveyed, "but the Great Crusade requires unity of action now more than ever. Focus upon the continued development of Ultramar. Build something that will endure, something that can serve as a model for the broader Imperium. Should circumstances change, should my vision prove insufficient to hold my sons together, it may be that your example will provide a foundation upon which something new can be constructed." The words were cryptic, yet they carried unmistakable implications. The Emperor was not unaware of the tensions building among his Primarch sons. He was, in fact, placing what seemed like unusual emphasis on Guilliman's continued success in creating stable, productive structures. It was almost as though he was preparing for the possibility that the Great Crusade might not endure indefinitely. The notion troubled Guilliman in ways that his vast intellect could struggle to articulate. He had accepted his role as Primarch with the understanding that he was serving a greater purpose, that his military genius and organizational acumen were being directed toward the creation of a civilization that would last for ages to come. The possibility that the Emperor himself was harboring doubts about whether that civilization could actually maintain its unity was deeply disquieting. Yet even as he grappled with these abstract concerns, the practical work of expanding and consolidating Ultramar continued relentlessly. New worlds were incorporated into the administrative structure. More productive capacity came online. The population of the 500 worlds that constituted Guilliman's domain continued to grow, bringing with it new challenges and new opportunities for expansion and improvement. In his more contemplative moments, standing alone upon observation decks as the Macragge transited through warp space, Guilliman found himself thinking about the legacy that he was constructing. Would Ultramar endure? Would the principles he was establishing, the careful balance between strength and justice, between order and the respect for individual dignity, prove durable enough to survive the stresses that the future might bring? He thought often of Conor, his adoptive father, whose dying words had urged him to build something that would endure. In many ways, Ultramar represented the physical manifestation of that command. It was not merely a military domain or a conquered territory, it was the closest approximation to a truly human civilization that Guilliman could construct within the context of the brutal realities of the far future. The great assemblies of the Primarchs became increasingly tense affairs. Guilliman observed his brothers with the careful attention to detail that characterized all of his interactions. Horus grew more confident, more commanding, more willing to speak as though he possessed authority that extended beyond his own legion. Lorgar's religious fervor grew increasingly pronounced. His communications shot through with language that suggested he was interpreting the Emperor's vision in ways that deviated significantly from the original teachings. And gradually, Guilliman began to perceive the true scope of the danger that the Emperor had been obliquely referencing. His brothers were not merely diverging in their interpretations of human civilization. They were beginning to consider the possibility that the Emperor's vision might need to be fundamentally altered or even replaced entirely. The realization crystallized during a council aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, where the Primarchs gathered to discuss the progress of the Great Crusade across multiple sectors. The War Master stood at the centre of the gathering, his bearing radiating absolute confidence, his voice carrying notes of conviction that went far beyond mere military strategy. "My brothers," Horus declared, his eyes sweeping across the assembled Primarchs, "we have accomplished marvels. Entire sectors have been brought back into the light of human civilization. The Emperor's vision is being realized before our eyes. But I ask you to consider whether the Emperor's vision, admirable though it may be, is truly sufficient to the challenges that humanity faces." Guilliman watched as several of his brothers leaned forward, their attention fully captured by the War Master's words. The danger was palpable now, hovering at the edge of consciousness like a predator stalking prey. Horus was about to suggest something momentous, something that would alter the fundamental trajectory of the Great Crusade. But before the War Master could continue, Guilliman found himself rising to his feet, his massive frame drawing the attention of every being in the chamber. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm certainty that had characterized all of his interventions in matters of profound importance. "The Emperor's vision is sufficient," he said simply, "because it is grounded in principles rather than in the ambitions of individual beings. We are great, yes. We are mighty, yes. But our greatness is merely the instrument through which the Emperor's greater vision is realized. Should we begin to imagine that our visions supersede his, we risk fracturing the very unity upon which the Imperium's survival depends." The words hung in the air, and Guilliman perceived the subtle shifts in the chamber's atmosphere, the way his declaration had aligned certain Primarchs with his position, while seeming to harden others in their apparent commitment to wherever Horus had been leading them. The War Master's smile did not waver, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition perhaps that the united front he had been attempting to construct had encountered an obstacle in the form of the Primarch of the Ultramarines. The council ended without further major declarations, but the damage Guilliman realized had already been done. The seeds of division had been planted. The question now was not whether fracture would occur, but when, and whether anyone possessed the vision and strength to prevent that fracture from becoming the complete sundering of human civilization. In the weeks that followed, Guilliman redoubled his efforts to strengthen Ultramar. He expanded the already impressive defensive capabilities of the core worlds. He established intelligence networks designed to keep him informed of developments across the broader Imperium. He prepared, as best he could, for the possibility of a future that diverged radically from the golden age that the Great Crusade had seemed to promise. Standing once more upon the bridge of the Macragge, watching the stars stretch out before him in infinite number, Guilliman confronted the possibility that he had been given a task that transcended mere military conquest or administrative accomplishment. Perhaps, he thought, the Emperor had intended for him to serve as a foundation, not the grandest or most powerful of the Primarchs, but the one whose vision of order and justice, carefully constructed and patiently maintained, might prove durable enough to survive even the fall of all else. It was a heavy burden, that realization, but Guilliman had learned long ago that the greatest achievements were often born from the willingness to bear burdens that others considered too great for any single being to carry. The Great Crusade continued, but its golden age was already beginning to darken at the edges, shadows gathering where light had seemed so absolute just years before. Chapter 6. The Word, Bearers and Burning of Monarchia. The communication came through the astropathic choir like a scream of anguish translated into thought, a message of such profound disturbance that even the most experienced members of the Ultramarines' psychic communication network found themselves struggling to maintain their composure. Roboute Guilliman received the report in his war room aboard the Macragge, the data presented to him in stark, clinical terms that could not disguise the emotional devastation underlying the words. The Emperor had moved against Lorga Aurelian and the Word-Bearers. The incident had occurred on the world of Monarchia, where the entire population had gathered to celebrate the completion of a grand monument to the Emperor's divinity. The Emperor had arrived unannounced, assessed the religious fervour that had been cultivated by Lorga's legion, and rendered a judgment that echoed across the entire Imperium like the tolling of a funeral bell. The monument had been destroyed, deliberately, methodically, systematically torn down by the Emperor's own hand, each stone reduced to rubble as the assembled multitudes watched in horror and confusion. Lorga had been humiliated before his legion, before the population of Monarchia, before the watching eyes of the broader Imperium. The message the Emperor had conveyed was unmistakable. The word-bearers' interpretation of his vision was incorrect. Their cultivation of religious devotion, their elevation of the emperor to the status of a god, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Great Crusade was meant to accomplish. Guilliman read the report twice, processing not merely the explicit events but their implications. The emperor had acted with a severity that bordered on cruelty, had chosen public humiliation over private correction, had allowed his judgment to be rendered in a manner that Guilliman recognised as devastatingly effective at communicating disapproval. But effectiveness was not the only consequence of such a display. Wounds, Guilliman understood from his extensive study of human behaviour and military psychology, tended to fester when they were inflicted publicly, and Lorgar, despite his evident faith in the Emperor's divinity, was ultimately still human, still subject to the pride and resentment that such a public rebuke would naturally generate. Guilliman's enhanced intellect moved through the implications with perfect clarity. This was a moment of profound danger, a pivot point upon which the future trajectory of the Imperium might turn. Lorgar had been one of the more devoted of the Primarchs, his commitment to the Emperor's vision beyond question. If such devotion could be shattered by a public humiliation, then what protection existed against the resentment that other Primarchs might harbour? He summoned Captain Havelock and his senior officers to the war room, their arrival preceded by the precise military formality that characterised all Ultramarines' operations. They assembled before Guilliman's tactical display, their attention focused upon the Primarch with the absolute concentration that Space Marines could bring to bear upon matters of strategic importance. "Gentlemen," Guilliman began, his voice carrying the calm that had become his characteristic manner even in the face of developments that others might have found deeply troubling. "We have received reports of a significant development within the Wordbearers' Legion. The Emperor has deemed Lorgar's interpretation of his vision to be fundamentally flawed, and has taken direct action to correct that misinterpretation." The officers absorbed this information with the professional detachment expected of beings trained to process the violence and upheaval that characterised the military operations of the far future. But Guilliman perceived the subtle shifts in their bearing, the way that even Space Marines, augmented and indoctrinated as they were, could not entirely suppress the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the Emperor and his Primarch sons. "This event concerns me for reasons that extend beyond the immediate circumstances," Guilliman continued, his enhanced eyes moving across each assembled officer in turn. The word-bearers were devoted to the Emperor's vision. Lorgar was, by all accounts, genuinely committed to interpreting that vision correctly. And yet, faced with public rebuke of a severity that bordered on the deliberately humiliating, what guarantee exists that Lorgar will not begin to interpret the Emperor's actions as a betrayal rather than as necessary correction? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unignorable. Guilliman had articulated a concern that transcended the immediate crisis and spoke to a deeper fragility in the bonds that held the Imperium together. The Emperor's authority derived ultimately from the loyalty of his Primarch sons. That loyalty, Guilliman was beginning to understand, was not as absolute or unquestionable as the official narrative suggested. Captain Havelock cleared his throat, his aged face reflecting careful consideration of the Primarch's words. "My lord, if I may speak freely, it seems that the Emperor has acted with insufficient attention to the political consequences of his actions. Surely the Emperor would have considered such factors." The question was posed with the utmost respect, yet it contained within it a recognition that Guilliman himself was grappling with. The Emperor, for all his vast wisdom and power, had perhaps allowed his judgment to be influenced by anger or disappointment in a manner that transcended the purely strategic. It was a troubling thought, the recognition that even beings of godlike capability could be subject to emotional reactions that undermined their stated purposes. "The Emperor's judgment is absolute," Guilliman replied carefully, aware that his words would be repeated throughout the Ultramarines' Legion, that his interpretation of the Monarchia incident would shape how his subordinates understood both the event and the broader implications it carried. But wisdom sometimes requires that we understand our decisions not merely in terms of their immediate effects, but in terms of their broader consequences. He paused, allowing the weight of his statement to settle upon those assembled before him. What the Emperor has communicated through his actions on Monarchia is that the interpretation of his vision is not to be left to individual Primarchs. That religious fervour, no matter how well-intentioned, represents a deviation from the rational principles upon which the Imperium should be constructed. That dissent from the Emperor's explicit guidance will result in swift and devastating correction. The implications are profound, Guilliman continued, turning back to his tactical display, where the positions of the various Space Marine legions were marked in meticulous detail. We do not yet know how Lorgar will respond to this humiliation. We do not know what psychological effects such public rebuke will have upon the Word-Bearer's Legion. We must prepare for multiple potential scenarios. The orders that followed established a set of precautions designed to improve communications between the Ultramarines and the broader Imperium to strengthen Ultramar's defensive capabilities, and to position the Ultramarines in such a manner that they could respond swiftly to developing crises without requiring coordination with potentially unreliable elements of the military apparatus. But beyond the purely strategic preparations, Guilliman found himself engaging in a deeper contemplation of the implications of what had transpired. He composed a carefully worded communication to the Emperor, transmitted via astropath, expressing his concerns about the effects of public humiliation upon the unity of the Primarch Brotherhood. The response, when it came, carried undertones of something that Guilliman found difficult to categorize. There was satisfaction in the Emperor's words, a sense that the correction had been necessary and properly executed. But there were also hints of something more complex, a recognition, perhaps, that the incident had revealed truths about the fundamental nature of the bonds holding the Imperium together. Lorgar's error was not in his devotion, the Emperor's communication conveyed, but in his assumption that I required such devotion in the form of religious worship. The Imperium is to be built upon rational principles, upon the ordered application of human genius to the challenges of creating and maintaining a galactic civilization. Religious fervour, no matter how sincerely felt, represents a dangerous deviation from that foundation. Lorgar has been corrected. What he chooses to do with that correction remains to be seen. Guilliman understood what the Emperor was not explicitly stating. The correction had been delivered, but the question of whether Lorgar would accept it and move forward in a manner consistent with the Emperor's vision, or whether he would allow the wound of public humiliation to fester into something far more dangerous, remained unanswered. The weeks that followed brought reports from across the Imperium, whispers and official communications that painted a picture of a Word-Bearer's Legion struggling to comprehend what had transpired on Monarchia. Some elements of the Legion accepted the Emperor's judgment and began to purge their religious practices and iconography. Others seemed to resist, clinging to their faith even as official doctrine shifted around them. Guilliman watched these developments with the careful attention he brought to all matters of strategic importance. He expanded Ultramar's intelligence networks, positioning agents and resources in such a manner that he would be among the first to know should the Word-Bearers begin to move in directions that suggested outright rebellion against the Emperor's authority. But there was something else occurring as well, something far more subtle and perhaps far more significant. Within the gathering of Primarchs, Guilliman began to perceive a shift in the political alliances and alignments. Primarchs who had previously seemed relatively neutral began to gravitate toward either a position of absolute loyalty to the Emperor's explicit guidance or toward a position of questioning and doubt. And at the centre of this growing schism, Guilliman perceived the presence of Horus, the War Master, seemingly content to observe the fracturing of the Brotherhood while making no overt move to heal the breach. Indeed, there were suggestions in the subtle communications that filtered through Guilliman's intelligence networks that the War Master was perhaps deliberately cultivating certain discrepancies between the Emperor's vision and that of various Primarchs, sowing discord while maintaining the appearance of absolute loyalty. It was a realization that struck Guilliman with the force of physical impact. If Horus was deliberately working to undermine the unity of the Primarch Brotherhood, then the danger to the Imperium transcended mere differences in interpretation of the Emperor's teachings. It suggested the possibility of an organized conspiracy, a methodical effort to create the conditions under which fundamental fracture would become inevitable. In the depths of his personal chambers, surrounded by the technological marvels and carefully organized information systems that constituted his intellectual workspace, Guilliman began to compile the evidence. Subtle shifts in communications patterns, the careful cultivation of resentment in certain Primarchs, the seemingly deliberate arrangement of military operations in such a manner that some legions found themselves operating at odds with others. The pattern was becoming increasingly unmistakable, and yet, when Guilliman attempted to communicate his suspicions to the Emperor, the response was strange. almost dismissive, as though the Emperor either did not perceive the danger that Guilliman was identifying, or chose not to act upon such information. It was a response that troubled Guilliman far more deeply than any outright confirmation of his fears would have. Standing once more upon the observation deck of the Macragge, watching the stars stretch out in infinite profusion, Guilliman confronted a realization that transcended mere military or strategic analysis. The golden age of the Great Crusade, which had seemed so absolute just years before, was rapidly showing itself to be far more fragile than anyone had acknowledged. The bonds holding the Primarch Brotherhood together were fraying. The Emperor's vision, once seemingly monolithic and unquestionable, was being reinterpreted and questioned by multiple Primarchs. And at the centre of it all, someone or something was working methodically to transform these natural tensions into something far more catastrophic. The burning of Monarchia had been a message, Guilliman realised, but not merely the Emperor's message to Lorgar about the correct interpretation of his vision. It had been a flashpoint, a moment that revealed to all who possessed the wit to perceive it that the unity of the Imperium was far more fragile than the official narratives acknowledged, and somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, other Primarchs were drawing their own conclusions, making their own calculations about where loyalty truly lay and what the future might hold for those who stood at the centre of the greatest conflict humanity would ever experience. The Great Crusade continued, but its golden age was ending, shadows gathering like predators around a weakening prey. Chapter 7: The Istvan Betrayal. The message came through the astropathic choir like a shard of ice driven directly into the heart. Roboute Guilliman stood upon the bridge of the Macragge when the communication reached him, the psychic scream of a dying astropath translating into words that seemed almost incomprehensible in their implications. His enhanced mind processed the information with perfect clarity, even as something deeper within him struggled to accept what the words were conveying. Horus had turned. The War Master of the Imperium, the most celebrated and favoured of all the Emperor's sons, had betrayed his oath. The drop site of Istvan had become a charnel house, a place where the promise of unity had been shattered beneath the weight of treachery that operated on a scale almost too vast for the mind to encompass. The details emerged slowly, carried by fragmentary communications from those few who had survived the initial betrayal. Horus had gathered his most loyal followers under the pretense of dealing with an outbreak of heresy on Istvan Fomv. But instead of the straightforward military operation everyone had anticipated, he had orchestrated something far more insidious. Multiple Primarchs had been brought into the conspiracy. Lorgar, his faith twisted by the humiliation of Monarchia into something far darker than religious fervour. Mortarion, nursing grievances against the Emperor that Guilliman had not fully appreciated. Fulgrim, somehow turned or corrupted by forces that no one fully understood. The Iron Warriors under Perturabo had joined as well, bringing with them the bitter resentments of a Primas who had always felt himself undervalued and overlooked. And worst of all, perhaps, were the reports suggesting that other legions remained ambiguous in their loyalties, neither fully committed to Horus's betrayal nor absolutely certain in their commitment to the Emperor. Guilliman found himself gripping the rail of the command throne with force that would have crushed the weapon-grade ceramite had he not maintained perfect control over his enhanced musculature. Around him, the bridge of the Macragge fell into a shocked silence, the revelation of the betrayal rendering even the most experienced officers momentarily incapable of coherent response. Captain Havelock approached, his aged face bearing an expression of profound dismay. "My lord," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man confronting the fundamental collapse of everything he had believed in. "What are your orders? The other legions? We must contact them, warn them of the treachery." Guilliman's mind was already moving through the vast complexities of response, calculating trajectories and timeframes with the precision that had characterized all of his strategic efforts. But this situation transcended mere strategy. This was the end of the Golden Age made manifest, the fracturing of the Imperium not as a gradual philosophical divergence, but as open, vicious betrayal. "Contact the other Primarchs loyal to the Emperor," Guilliman commanded, his voice carrying the terrible calm that emerged when he was forced to contemplate catastrophe. "Establish communication with Corax, with Lion L. Johnson, with Sanguinius. We must coordinate our response immediately. Horus has initiated a campaign of galactic proportions. We cannot allow him to consolidate his position. or gather additional forces to his cause. But even as he issued the orders, Guilliman was gripped by a realization that transcended military calculations. The Emperor had known something was wrong. The cryptic warnings, the emphasis on building Ultramar as a foundation that might need to endure independently, the careful way in which the Emperor had positioned certain elements of the military apparatus, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. The Emperor had not merely suspected the possibility of betrayal, he had anticipated it, had made preparations to mitigate its effects. The communications that Guilliman sent out across the galactic void in the hours that followed represented his most desperate efforts to salvage something from the catastrophe that was unfolding. He coordinated with those Primarchs who remained loyal to the Emperor, worked to establish a unified response to the traitor legions, and began the devastating calculations that would determine where the limited loyal forces could be most effectively deployed against enemies that now numbered among humanity's greatest warriors. But even as these military calculations proceeded, Guilliman found himself grappling with a deeper anguish that transcended mere strategic analysis. Brothers he had known and worked alongside were now confirmed as traitors. The Warmaster himself, the being whom the Emperor had elevated above all other Primarchs, had revealed himself to be a servant of something far darker than mere ambition. The intelligence reports that began to filter through in the days that followed painted a picture of horror and sophisticated coordination. The traitor Primarchs had been preparing for this moment for far longer than anyone had suspected. Entire legions had been subverted, their loyalty redirected through a combination of manipulation, outright corruption, and the appeal of a vision that promised far more personal power and authority than the Emperor's vision of ordered unity could provide. Worst of all were the reports suggesting that some of the betrayal involved forces beyond the normal scope of human conflict. Whispers of dark gods, of entities that dwelt in the warp itself, of promises made and bargains struck that had transformed some of the Primarchs into something far more terrifying than mere ambitious military commanders. Guilliman found himself confronted with a reality that his vast intellect had struggled to fully accept. The Great Crusade, that glorious endeavour to bring human civilization back to its former glory, had been doomed from the moment of its inception. The Emperor, for all his wisdom and power, had created the circumstances of his own downfall by creating the Primarchs. Beings of such vast capability, such profound ambition, such fundamental alienation from normal humanity, could not indefinitely be bound by loyalty to a single vision or authority. The calculated efforts to reach Terra and reinforce the Emperor's position began almost immediately. Guilliman coordinated with the other loyal Primarchs, pooling their remaining forces and attempting to punch through toward the Imperial Palace itself. But the space between worlds, always vast and treacherous, suddenly became actively hostile in ways that transcended mere military opposition. The ruined storm appeared almost as though, in response to the crisis, a catastrophic disturbance in the warp that rendered rapid transit across vast distances nearly impossible. It was as though the very fabric of space and reality had been torn asunder, creating barriers that seemed almost deliberately designed to prevent the loyal forces from reaching Terra in time to defend the Emperor against the traitor legions. Guilliman watched in helpless frustration as his calculations of possible trajectories and travel times became increasingly irrelevant. The Ultramarines could fight their way through traitor legions. They could endure siege and bombardment, but they could not overcome the fundamental hostility of the warp itself, the reality that space travel through the Imperium had become far more difficult and unpredictable than it had ever been during the relatively stable conditions of the Great Crusade. In his private communications with Corax and the other loyal Primarchs, Guilliman began to grapple with a terrible realization. They would not reach Terra in time. Whatever fate awaited the Emperor, the loyal forces would not arrive in time to prevent it. The question was no longer how to save the Emperor, but how to salvage something from the wreckage of a civilization that was collapsing far faster than anyone had anticipated. The campaigns that followed were a nightmare of desperate warfare against enemies who had once been brothers, now revealed as traitors to everything that Guilliman had fought to build. The Ultramarines under his command showed no signs of wavering in their loyalty, fighting with the precision and discipline that had always characterized them, but their commitment could not overcome the sheer scale of the betrayal. Guilliman found himself leading his legion through battles that seemed to repeat endlessly, each victory hard-won and temporary, each defeat carrying the weight of permanent loss. Entire worlds fell to traitor forces. Industrial capacity that Ultramar had carefully developed over centuries was destroyed in the madness of civil war. The civilian populations that Guilliman had worked so carefully to integrate into a cohesive civilization found themselves torn apart by conflict between forces they could not possibly comprehend. The anguish that accompanied these realizations was something that Guilliman struggled to fully articulate even within his own consciousness. He had been given a gift by the Emperor, the capability to see patterns, to understand complex systems, to build things of lasting significance. And now all of that capability seemed utterly inadequate to the scale of the catastrophe that was consuming everything he had worked to construct. In the depths of a particularly devastating campaign, fighting alongside his most trusted officers against an overwhelming force of traitor Space Marines, Guilliman finally allowed himself to confront the full weight of his failure. The Golden Age was over, not merely concluded naturally but shattered, destroyed, rendered into nothing but ash and regret by forces far more powerful than mere military might. He thought of Conor, his adoptive father, whose dying words had urged him to build something that would endure. He thought of Macragge, his homeworld, and wondered if it still stood or if it too had been consumed in the fires of the heresy. He thought of the Emperor, whom he had never met face to face after that first transcendent encounter, and wondered if his father yet lived or if he had already fallen to the traitor forces converging on Terra. But even in the depths of that anguish, something within Guilliman refused to surrender to despair. The Ultramarines remained. Ultramar, despite the losses and the devastation, still possessed the infrastructure and the will to resist. If the loyal forces could not save the Emperor, if they could not prevent the collapse of the Imperium as it had been known, then perhaps they could at least preserve the means by which something new might eventually be built from the ruins. The decision crystallized in his mind with terrible clarity. He would not attempt to reach Terra. Instead, he would consolidate his forces, defend Ultramar against the traitor legions, and focus his efforts on creating a realm that could endure independent of the broader Imperium if necessary. The Emperor had given him that instruction, Guilliman realized, embedded in the careful way that Guilliman had been positioned to build something self-sufficient and resilient. It was not the destiny that Guilliman had envisioned for himself, not the glorious role he had imagined playing in the continuation of humanity's ascendance, but it was a destiny nonetheless, one that demanded everything he possessed and offered no guarantee of success or even survival. Standing in a command center surrounded by the wreckage of his strategic plans and the communications of ongoing disasters, Guilliman reached out across the warp with his astropathic network and sent a final message toward Terra, knowing with terrible certainty that it would likely not arrive in time. Emperor, the message conveyed, if you yet live, know that your son remains loyal. The Ultramarines will endure. Ultramar will endure. And from the ashes of what is to come, we will build something new. It was all he could offer now. Not victory, but survival. Not triumph, but the promise of continuation. As the Horus Heresy descended upon the galaxy in all its terrible fury, Guilliman turned his full attention to the grim necessity of fighting a war that he knew could not be won, only endured. The Golden Age was over. The long night was beginning. Chapter 8. The Codex Astartes. The silence that followed the end of the Horus Heresy was perhaps more deafening than the roar of 10,000 battlefields. Robert Guilliman stood within the newly constructed fortress monastery on Macragge, surrounded by the remnants of a civilization that had been shattered beyond all recognition, and contemplated the staggering responsibility that now rested upon his shoulders. The war was over. The Emperor lay entombed upon the golden throne, suspended between life and death in a state that no one fully understood. And humanity, fractured and bleeding, looked to those who still possessed strength and vision to determine what would come next. The losses had been incomprehensible in their scale. Of the 20 Space Marine legions that had existed at the height of the Great Crusade, only 9 remained in any meaningful capacity. Entire worlds had been scoured of human life. The technological sophistication that had been so carefully preserved and advanced during the years of the Crusade had been set back centuries by the deliberate destruction wrought by both traitor and loyal forces, and the psyche of the Imperium itself had been wounded in ways that might never fully heal. Guilliman had spent the months immediately following the Emperor's entombment engaged in what amounted to salvage operations. He had consolidated the remaining forces of the Ultramarines, gathered the other loyal Primarchs and their legions, and worked systematically to contain the worst of the chaos that threatened to consume what remained of human civilization. But such immediate crisis management, though necessary, could address only the symptoms of a far deeper malady. The fundamental question that demanded answering was simple, yet almost impossibly complex. How would humanity survive without the Emperor? How would the Imperium maintain itself across the vast distances of the galaxy, with populations isolated and often barely capable of maintaining their own existence, much less contributing to a broader civilization? The answer that Guilliman began to formulate was born from the bitter lessons of the heresy itself. The Primarchs, in all their vast capability, had proven to be a fundamentally destabilizing force. Their ambitions, their pride, their fundamental alienation from normal humanity had made them vectors for corruption and betrayal. The most powerful being who had ever walked the galaxy had been brought low not by external enemies, but by the rebellion of his own sons. It was this realization that shaped the Codex Astartes, the work of compiling and codifying the military doctrine that would guide the Space Marines for millennia to come, began in Guilliman's personal war room, surrounded by data slates and the careful accumulation of knowledge drawn from centuries of military campaigns. But it was far more than mere military manual. The Codex represented Guilliman's distilled understanding of what had gone wrong, his comprehensive analysis of how to prevent such catastrophe from occurring again. Captain Havelock, now ancient beyond even the augmentation that Space Marines typically possessed, served as Guilliman's primary collaborator in this monumental effort. The old captain would appear daily in the war room, his movements slow but his mind still sharp as a blade, and they would discuss the fine points of organisation, discipline, and the careful distribution of authority that would guide human military forces for ages to come. The fundamental premise was straightforward yet revolutionary. The massive legions that had dominated the Great Crusade would be subdivided into smaller independent chapters, each self-sufficient but also limited in the amount of power that any single commander could wield. No single being would ever again command forces comparable to what Horus had possessed. No individual would ever again be in a position to threaten the stability of the entire Imperium through military rebellion. But the Codex was far more comprehensive than mere organisational structure. Guilliman's vast intellect had been applied to every aspect of Space Marine training, deployment and tactical doctrine. The work addressed strategy and tactics, supply lines and logistics, the relationship between the Space Marines and the broader Imperium, and the fundamental principles upon which Space Marine conduct should be grounded. Most importantly, the Codex emphasized discipline. Not the blind obedience that might be expected from mere soldiers, but the discipline of carefully considered decisions grounded in principles that extended far beyond the ego or ambitions of individual commanders. A Space Marine was to be a weapon, yes, but also a guardian, a protector of human civilization grounded in an understanding that such protection had profound moral dimensions that transcended mere military effectiveness. The work consumed Guilliman for what felt like both an instant and an eternity. Days blended into weeks, blended into months as he poured his vast intellect into the articulation of principles that he believed could guide humanity through the long darkness that he perceived approaching. There were moments when he questioned whether such principles could truly endure, whether the fundamental nature of the Space Marines, beings of such vast capability and augmentation, could truly be constrained by mere doctrine. But there were also moments of clarity, instances when a particular formulation seemed to crystallize something essential, when the weight of his understanding found perfect expression in the careful language that characterized the Codex's chapters. These moments of achievement provided the motivation to continue, to persist through the frustration and self-doubt that occasionally threatened to overwhelm his otherwise unshakable determination. As the Codex grew in scope and depth, Guilliman began to circulate drafts to the other loyal Primarchs, seeking their counsel and their perspectives on military doctrine, and the broader question of how humanity could be reorganized to survive the Emperor's withdrawal from active involvement in galactic affairs. The responses were varied, reflecting the different experiences and perspectives of beings who had all endured the heresy, but from vastly different positions. Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels offered strategic insights drawn from his campaigns across the Imperium's eastern reaches. Sanguinius, the tragic figure who had sacrificed himself to allow the Emperor to be transported to the Golden Throne, had left behind careful notes on the conduct of warfare that emphasized honor and the importance of maintaining human dignity even in the prosecution of military campaigns. Corax and his Raven Guard provided perspectives on the necessity of flexibility and adaptation, particularly for forces operating in isolation far from central authority. Even Rogel Dawn, the Imperial Fist, who had assumed a role of significant authority in the post-heresy reorganization of the Imperium, contributed his own insights, though his communications carried undertones of disagreement with some of Guilliman's more radical proposals. Dawn seemed to believe that the answer to the heresy lay in the strengthening of central authority, in the creation of tighter controls and more centralized command structures. Guilliman, drawing from his own experiences during the heresy, believed precisely the opposite. Centralized authority had been the vector through which Horus had threatened to consume the entire Imperium. The answer was not tighter control, but better distribution of power and responsibility. The fundamental philosophical tension between these two approaches shaped much of the debate that surrounded the Codex in its early iterations. Dawn believed that humanity's survival depended upon the creation of powerful, centralized institutions capable of enforcing their will across the vast distances of space. Guilliman believed that humanity's survival depended upon the creation of robust, resilient, distributed systems capable of functioning independently should central authority fail or become corrupted. As time passed and the Codex evolved through its iterations, Guilliman found himself increasingly convinced that his approach was correct. The Space Marines, distributed across multiple chapters and operating according to principles rather than through direct command, could serve as a stabilizing force across human space. They could respond to local crises without requiring coordination from distant authority. They could defend human worlds and maintain order without the risk of being concentrated under a single command that might prove vulnerable to corruption or betrayal. The final version of the Codex Astartes was completed 5 years after the Emperor's entombment on the Golden Throne. The work was staggering in its scope, running to thousands of pages and covering every conceivable aspect of Space Marine organization, training, and conduct. It was simultaneously a military manual, a philosophical treatise, an organizational blueprint, and a moral framework. When Guilliman presented the completed work to the assembled remnants of the Imperium's military and civilian leadership, the response was profound. The Codex provided structure where chaos threatened. It offered principles where moral clarity had been shattered by the revelations of the heresy. And most importantly, it provided a roadmap for how the Imperium might survive and potentially even recover from the devastation that had been inflicted upon it. The Space Marine chapters were reorganized according to the Codex's specifications. The massive legions were systematized into smaller self-contained units, each with its own chapter master and command structure. Stricter protocols were established governing the relationship between the Space Marines and the broader Imperium. Supply chains were rationalized according to principles that emphasized resilience and the ability to operate independently if necessary. And as the Codex was implemented, something remarkable began to occur. The Space Marines, far from resenting the constraints that the new organizational structure imposed upon them, seemed to embrace it. The discipline that the Codex demanded proved to be not a burden, but a source of strength and identity. Being a Space Marine was no longer merely a matter of possessing superhuman augmentation and vast military capability. It was to be part of a tradition grounded in principles that extended far beyond individual ambition. Guilliman watched this transformation with a sense of satisfaction tempered by the knowledge of how much had been lost to achieve it. The Golden Age was truly over. The glorious days of the Great Crusade, when humanity had seemed on the verge of reclaiming the entire galaxy and establishing a civilization of unimaginable scope and achievement, were gone forever. But something else was being built from the ruins. Not a return to former glory, but a new form of civilization grounded in the hard-won knowledge of what happened when power became too concentrated, when authority was not tempered by careful distribution of responsibility. The Codex Astartes would not save humanity. Nothing could accomplish that. But perhaps it could preserve the means by which humanity might continue to exist, might maintain the knowledge and capability necessary to endure the long darkness that Guilliman increasingly perceived stretching ahead. In the months that followed the completion of the Codex, Guilliman found himself increasingly drawn away from the immediate concerns of military administration and toward the broader question of how Ultramar could be reorganized to survive independently if necessary. He began what would become decades of work constructing defensive fortifications, establishing redundant communication systems, and ensuring that the realm of 500 worlds possessed the infrastructure necessary to sustain itself indefinitely. It was not the destiny he had imagined. He had not anticipated that his role would transition so completely from the grand strategic campaigns of the Great Crusade to the careful, methodical work of building systems designed to endure through chaos. But Guilliman had learned through bitter experience that the highest form of leadership was not the inspiration that drove warriors to glorious deeds, but the careful stewardship that preserved the means by which civilization itself could continue to exist. The Codex Astartes would become the foundation upon which the Space Marines would be rebuilt. It would guide their actions for 10,000 years and beyond. And in creating it, Guilliman had perhaps accomplished something far more significant than any military victory could have provided. He had created a document that would outlast him, that would shape the destiny of countless beings across millennia, that would serve as a testament to the possibility that from catastrophe could emerge not mere survival, but the foundations of something that might eventually become great once more. Standing within the depths of the fortress monastery, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge and carefully preserved technologies of human civilization, Guilliman allowed himself a moment of something approaching satisfaction. The work was far from complete. The Imperium remained fractured and endangered, chaos threatened from within and without. But the means had been established by which at least the possibility of endurance existed, and in the grim darkness of the far future, mere possibility was sometimes the greatest gift that leadership could provide. Chapter 9. The Long Decline, 10,000 Years. The span of time was almost incomprehensible, a duration that transcended the normal parameters of human consciousness and stretched beyond the scope of even the most ambitious historical records. Robert Guilliman existed within that duration not as a living being engaged in active stewardship, but as something far stranger. A consciousness preserved in stasis, suspended between life and death, maintained in a state of suspended animation that allowed for neither growth nor change, only an eternal, unchanging vigilance. The decision to enter stasis had not come easily. Guilliman had resisted it for decades after the completion of the Codex Astartes, clinging to the belief that his continued presence was necessary to guide the reconstruction of human civilization. But as centuries passed, and he watched the very principles that he had so carefully articulated begin to be distorted and misinterpreted, as he observed the gradual corruption of his teachings by those who lacked the vision to understand them, he came to recognize a terrible truth. His presence, rather than serving as a stabilizing force, had become an obstacle to the Imperium's ability to adapt and evolve. The religious movements that had begun to coalesce around the figure of the Emperor had gradually spread to encompass the Primarchs as well. Guilliman found himself increasingly venerated as a demigod, his words treated not as careful analyses subject to debate and modification, but as sacred pronouncements that could not be questioned or altered. The Codex Astartes, which he had crafted as a living document meant to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances, was being ossified into dogma, its principles treated as immutable law rather than as foundational guidance meant to be interpreted intelligently by commanders confronting specific challenges. The ecclesiarchy, that sprawling religious institution, which had begun to form in the aftermath of the heresy, viewed Guilliman with a mixture of reverence and barely concealed hostility. His emphasis on rational principles, on the preservation of knowledge through systematic study rather than through religious faith, represented a direct challenge to their authority and their interpretation of how the Imperium should function. They could not openly move against him. His reputation and his remaining military forces made such direct action unthinkable, but they worked systematically to undermine his influence, to reinterpret his teachings in ways that brought them into alignment with religious doctrine. The first major schism occurred 3 centuries after the heresy's end, when a faction within the Adeptus Mechanicus, claiming to interpret Guilliman's writings on the preservation of technology, attempted to establish a unified code of technological practice that directly contradicted principles that Guilliman had articulated regarding the necessity of adapting ancient systems to current needs. The conflict that resulted threatened to fracture the Imperium's industrial capacity, at a moment when such unity was desperately needed to confront growing threats from beyond human space. Guilliman attempted to intervene, to clarify his position and restore proper understanding of his principles. But his efforts only seemed to deepen the schism. Every attempt at clarification was reinterpreted as divine revelation. Every effort to explain his reasoning was treated as mysterious pronouncement. He found himself trapped in a cycle where his attempts to correct misunderstandings only generated new layers of mythological interpretation around whatever he chose to communicate. The realization that his continued presence was counterproductive, that the best service he could provide to the Imperium was to step aside and allow it to develop according to its own principles rather than in constant reference to his authority, came to Guilliman with the weight of profound resignation. It was perhaps the most difficult decision he had ever made, the choice to voluntarily withdraw from active involvement in the civilization that he had worked so carefully to construct. The scouring campaigns that followed his decision to withdraw consumed most of his remaining years of active engagement. The traitor legions had not been entirely eliminated by the end of the heresy. Scattered forces of corrupted space marines and their chaos-mutated followers persisted in the darkness between human worlds, conducting raids and attempting to establish footholds in human space. The systematic campaigns that Guilliman led to eliminate these remnants stretched across centuries and consumed vast resources. But even as these military campaigns proceeded, Guilliman worked to establish the conditions that would allow Ultramar to endure independently if necessary. He constructed vast fortress monasteries throughout the realm. He established training facilities designed to preserve and transmit the knowledge necessary to maintain the advanced technologies upon which human civilization depended. He carefully trained successors, individuals who might not possess his vast intellect, but who possessed integrity and commitment to principles that transcended mere personal ambition. Most importantly, he worked to ensure that the 500 worlds of Ultramar possessed genuine autonomy. Rather than creating structures of dependency that would collapse if central authority failed, he established systems of mutual trade and support that would allow each world to sustain itself while benefiting from connection to the broader network. Agricultural worlds could exchange their surplus for manufactured goods. Industrial centers could distribute their products throughout the realm. Fortress monasteries could serve as centers of learning and military strength, distributed throughout the region in such a manner that no single world's loss would prove catastrophic. As the centuries accumulated into millennia, Guilliman watched with a kind of horrified fascination as the Imperium transformed in ways that departed ever further from the vision he had articulated. The rational principles upon which he had attempted to ground human civilization gave way gradually to increasingly elaborate religious structures. The careful attention to maintaining and improving technology was replaced by a kind of cargo cult reverence for pre-heresy artifacts. Knowledge that could have been preserved and improved was instead sealed away in sacred vaults, preserved in a state of stagnation that prevented growth but also prevented loss. And Ultramar, isolated at the periphery of the Imperium, gradually began to show signs of degradation as well. The carefully constructed balance between central authority and distributed responsibility began to fray as successive generations of rulers lacked the vision to maintain what Guilliman had established. Trade networks fell into disrepair. Fortress monasteries became isolated strongholds rather than centers of learning and mutual support. The population of the 500 worlds, no longer able to depend upon the dynamic economic systems that Guilliman had created, began to stagnate and decline. Guilliman watched these developments from an increasingly isolated position, his communications with the broader Imperium becoming less frequent as the centuries passed. He could have fought against this degradation, could have used his vast authority to impose the systems and principles that he believed necessary for Ultramar's survival. But he had already learned, through bitter experience with the religious movements that had grown up around him, that trying to prevent such decline only generated new forms of mythological interpretation that further distorted his intentions. The decision to enter stasis was made in consultation with his remaining advisors and closest confidants, a small group of individuals who had devoted their lives to maintaining Ultramar according to the principles that Guilliman had established. The process itself was undertaken with meticulous care, the construction of a stasis chamber designed according to specifications that Guilliman himself had developed, taking into account the best understanding of the preservation technology that had survived the dark age of technology. Before entering the chamber, Guilliman composed a series of messages and directives intended for those who would govern Ultramar during his absence. These documents carefully articulated the principles he believed necessary for the realm's survival, while avoiding the trap of creating rigid structures that would prove incapable of adapting to unexpected circumstances. They emphasize flexibility, the importance of maintaining knowledge and capability, and the absolute necessity of grounding all governance in principles of justice and respect for human dignity. But even as he articulated these final instructions, Guilliman harboured profound doubts about whether they would prove sufficient. The degradation of Ultramar had proceeded far more rapidly than he would have anticipated, and the forces driving that degradation seemed almost inevitable, arising naturally from the basic human tendency toward conservatism and the fear of change that characterized societies under stress. The entry into stasis was accompanied by a kind of profound melancholy. Guilliman was abandoning not merely his active role in governance, but his very engagement with the ongoing life of the civilization he had worked so carefully to construct. The decision was rational, grounded in the logical recognition that his presence had become counterproductive. But it was nonetheless accompanied by emotions that transcended pure rationality, a sense of loss, of failure, of having attempted to construct something that proved ultimately beyond the capacity of lesser beings to maintain. As consciousness faded and the stasis field activated around him, Guilliman's final conscious thought was a prayer, directed toward the Emperor he had never truly known, expressing the hope that somehow, against all odds, something of what he had attempted to build might survive the long darkness that he perceived approaching. The millennia that followed his entry into stasis were unkind to Ultramar. Without his active guidance, the careful balance that he had established gradually deteriorated. The fortress monasteries, no longer maintained with the precision that Guilliman had insisted upon, began to fall into disrepair. The trade networks that had held the 500 worlds together through mutual benefit gradually fractured as individual worlds focused increasingly on their own local survival at the expense of broader cooperation. The Ultramarines themselves, the Space Marine chapter that Guilliman had personally guided through the Horus Heresy and the early centuries of the post-Heresy period, maintained their commitment to the Codex Astartes with impressive fidelity. But even they began to develop interpretations of the Codex that diverged from what Guilliman had originally intended, reading into his carefully crafted language meanings and implications that served the purposes of individual chapter masters and the political dynamics of the broader Imperium. Wars came to Ultramar with increasing frequency. First, there were the campaigns against remnants of chaos forces that had managed to establish footholds at the periphery of human space. Then came the conflicts with alien civilizations, creatures that had evolved in the darkness between human worlds and saw the territories controlled by human populations as legitimate targets for expansion and conquest. And gradually, as the millennia accumulated, there were conflicts between human worlds themselves, disputes over resources and territory that escalated from local conflicts into something approaching civil war. The 500 worlds that had been so carefully integrated into a cohesive whole by Guilliman gradually fragmented into isolated population centres, each struggling to survive against the mounting pressures of an increasingly hostile galaxy. Some worlds fell entirely, their populations destroyed by warfare or by the slow degradation that came from being cut off from the broader network of human civilization. Others persisted in isolated enclaves, maintaining a shadow of the prosperity they had once known. And through it all, Guilliman slept, preserved in stasis deep within the fortress monastery of Macragge, his consciousness maintained in a state of unchanging suspension, unable to perceive the slow destruction of everything he had worked to build. His final words, the careful instructions and principles that he had left behind, proved largely inadequate to the vast challenge of maintaining Ultramar through the long decline that characterized the late stages of the Imperium's slow death spiral. 10,000 years, approximately. No one could truly measure the passage of time with precision in an age when the Imperium itself had lost most of its capability to track years and decades with the regularity that had once characterized human civilization. But by the reckoning of those few who still possessed the knowledge to measure such things, approximately 10,000 years had passed since Robert Guilliman entered stasis. In that time, the Imperium had not fallen entirely, though it had contracted to a fraction of its former territorial extent. The Emperor still lived, suspended upon the golden throne, a being neither alive nor dead, his consciousness vast and distant, capable of perceiving the galaxy through mechanisms that no one fully understood. And Ultramar, against all odds, persisted, diminished, isolated, struggling, but persisting nonetheless. The population of the 500 worlds had been reduced to perhaps a quarter of what it had been during the height of Guilliman's active rule. The grand infrastructure that he had constructed had largely fallen into ruin, its maintenance requiring a level of technical sophistication that the populations of his worlds had largely lost. The fortress monasteries, which should have served as centres of learning and military strength, had become isolated citadels, their garrisons increasingly focused on mere survival rather than on the broader projects of cultural and technological preservation. And yet, something of what Guilliman had attempted to build had endured. The principles that he had articulated in the Codex Astartes had spread far beyond Ultramar, becoming the foundation upon which the Space Marines themselves were organised and guided. The systematic approach to military organisation and strategy that he had developed had proven resilient enough to survive millennia of cultural degradation and misinterpretation, and the realm of 500 worlds, though diminished and isolated, had maintained enough of the structure and the productive capacity to continue existing as a coherent political and military entity. It was not the triumph that Guilliman had envisioned, not the bright future of continued human advancement and expansion that had seemed so possible during the early years of the Great Crusade, but it was survival. In the grim darkness of the far future, where civilizations rose and fell like waves upon a shore, where vast empires crumbled to dust within mere millennia, the persistence of even a diminished Ultramar represented a kind of victory against the entropy that threatened to consume all things. And somewhere in the depths of the fortress monastery of Macragge, suspended in stasis and awaiting an awakening that seemed impossible, Roboute Guilliman slept, his vast intellect dreaming of golden ages and grand visions that had proven too fragile to endure the weight of human nature and the pressures of an uncaring universe. Chapter 10: The Resurrection. The awakening came not as a gentle transition from sleep to consciousness, but as a violent rupture between states of being so fundamentally different that Robert Guilliman's mind struggled to process the distinction. One moment there was nothing, not darkness, not silence, but an absolute absence of perception that transcended mere sleep. The next moment, sensation crashed over him like a tidal wave, flooding every augmented sense with information that his recovering consciousness could barely pass. Pain registered first, a sharp, insistent agony that spread through his entire being like wildfire through dry grass. His enhanced nervous system, awakened from 10,000 years of suspension, registered the shock of reactivation with a clarity that was almost unbearable. Guilliman's eyes snapped open, revealing not the familiar stone ceiling of the stasis chamber he remembered entering, but a completely alien landscape of advanced technology and carefully monitored medical apparatus. The figure standing before him was old, ancient beyond any reasonable measure of human lifespan. Yet her bearing suggested a presence that had endured through ages. Her face was weathered like ancient parchment, her eyes carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated knowledge and careful purpose. Belisarius Call. The name came to Guilliman not through introduction, but through some mechanism of direct mental communication that bypassed the need for verbal explanation. "Welcome back, my lord," Cal said, her voice carrying a quality of profound satisfaction mixed with something that might have been relief. "The resurrection has been successful. You have been brought back to consciousness after 10,047 years of stasis. The process was complicated, but you live. Against all odds, you live." Guilliman attempted to respond, found his throat and vocal apparatus still recovering from their extended dormancy. He moved his massive frame carefully, testing the extent of his augmented mobility, assessing the condition of muscles and joints that should have been destroyed by such prolonged immobility. Instead, he found that the stasis chamber had done precisely what it was designed to do, preserved him in a state of perfect suspension, ready for reactivation, as though merely days rather than millennia had passed. The armour. A new suit had been constructed for him, one that responded to his neural impulses with a precision that made even the sophisticated equipment he had worn during his active rule seem primitive by comparison. The designation that echoed through his consciousness was the Armour of Ruin, a name that carried implications Guilliman was not yet prepared to fully contemplate. It was not his old armour. That relic had been lost to the ravages of 10,000 years. This was something new, something crafted specifically for a being resurrected into a civilization that had transformed almost beyond recognition. "Help me to understand," Guilliman said finally, his voice rough from disuse but still carrying the note of authority that had characterized all of his communications throughout his active life. "What has transpired? How long have I slept? What is the condition of Ultramar? Of the Imperium?" The questions emerged in careful sequence, ordered by their importance, proceeding from the immediate and personal toward the vast and cosmic. Call moved to provide him with a data slate, the interface calibrated to allow direct neural access so that Guilliman could absorb information at the accelerated rate that his enhanced cognition permitted. What he encountered in that data was beyond even his vast capacity for rapid processing. 10,000 years. The Imperium had contracted to a fraction of its former size. Technology that had been carefully preserved had been lost or deliberately hidden away in sacred vaults. The religious elements that had begun to corrupt the Imperium during his waking years had evolved into something far more absolute. An entire civilization organized around the worship of the Emperor as a deity, fundamentally contradicting nearly everything that Guilliman had worked to establish. And Ultramar, his realm. The 500 worlds that he had so carefully constructed had been reduced through warfare, isolation, and simple degradation to a fraction of their former population and productive capacity. Some had fallen entirely, their populations extinguished. Others persisted as isolated enclaves, having lost the knowledge to maintain the vast infrastructure that Guilliman had established. The shock of this revelation was accompanied by a wave of emotion so intense that even his carefully trained discipline struggled to contain it. Everything, all of it had been lost. The vision he had articulated, the principles he had so carefully established, the civilization he had attempted to construct to endure through the darkness, all of it had been degraded and distorted beyond recognition. How is this possible? Guilliman's voice carried an edge that was not quite desperation, but something approaching it. The Codex Astartes. The systems I established. The training programs, the redundancies, the careful distribution of authority designed specifically to prevent this kind of degradation. How have 10,000 years been sufficient to reduce everything to this state of decay? Call's ancient face bore an expression of profound sadness, mingled with grim determination. The answer is simple and devastating, my lord. Humanity is not rational. Your principles, however carefully articulated, require beings capable of understanding them at the level of depth that you possessed. When you withdrew into stasis, you removed the presence that could interpret and reinforce those principles, and in your absence, they were systematized, simplified, degraded into dogma that bore only superficial resemblance to what you had intended. The explanation was logical, irrefutable. Guilliman had anticipated such degradation even before entering stasis, had been aware that his principles might be misinterpreted. But knowing something intellectually was vastly different from confronting the reality of its occurrence on such a catastrophic scale. "But there is more," Call continued, and her voice carried a quality of urgent importance. "You were not resurrected by chance, my lord. The forces at work that created the conditions for your awakening are diverse and complex. There are those within the Imperium who have preserved knowledge of your original principles, who have maintained hope that one day you might be restored. And there are other forces, alien powers and entities, that have their own reasons for wishing to see the Lord Commander of mankind awakened." The briefing that followed was comprehensive and deeply disturbing. Guilliman learned of the rise of chaos in the galaxy, of the way that the fundamental corruption that had driven the Horus Heresy had evolved over 10,000 years into something far more extensive and insidious. He learned of the ruin storm that had prevented his reaching terror at the moment of greatest need, and how that same phenomenon had persisted across millennia, isolating vast regions of space from the broader Imperium. He learned of the Xenos threats that had emerged during the ages of humanity's decline, alien civilizations that had either evolved naturally or been stirred to activity by the slow degradation of human power, and he learned of the state of the Imperium itself, fragmented, isolated, slowly decaying, its population in many regions reduced to tribal societies that barely maintained awareness that a broader human civilization existed. But he also learned of something else, forces that had worked across 10,000 years toward the goal of his resurrection. The Inari, an unexpected faction among the Eldar, had devoted significant resources to his awakening, believing that his return might serve their own purposes, and within the Imperium itself an organization known as the Mechanicus Explorator Fleet, led by individuals like Cawl who had devoted their entire existences to the task, had laboured ceaselessly to construct the means by which Guilliman might be restored to consciousness. The question that Guilliman found himself grappling with was not merely what had happened, but what was expected of him now. He was being resurrected not as a figure of the distant past, but as an active participant in the present crisis. The Imperium was dying, had been dying for millennia, and those who had arranged his awakening clearly expected that his presence, his intellect, his vast capability for understanding and organising complex systems would somehow prove sufficient to reverse the slide toward extinction. It was a burden beyond measure, and yet, as Guilliman stood within the advanced medical facility that had served as the site of his resurrection and considered the scope of what he was being asked to accomplish, he found a strange kind of clarity emerging from the chaos of his emotions. "I need to see Macragge," he said finally, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had characterized his leadership even in the face of catastrophe. "I need to assess the current state of Ultramar directly, to understand what has endured and what has been lost, and then I need to meet with the leadership of the broader Imperium. If I am to accept this burden of resurrection, I must understand the full scope of the challenge that has been placed before me." Cawl nodded, a gesture that seemed to carry profound satisfaction. "Your reactivation was always contingent upon your accepting a broader role," she said. "There are factions within the Imperium that have been waiting for this moment. St. Celestine, an individual of profound spiritual significance within the Imperium, has been preserved specifically to assist in your integration into contemporary Imperial society. And there are forces at work that suggest your return is not merely symbolic, but practically significant to the Imperium's ability to confront the challenges facing it. The journey from the laboratory of Cowl's Arc Mechanicus to Macragge was undertaken through space that Guilliman found almost unrecognisable. The warp, even at a distance, felt profoundly wrong in ways that transcended mere military assessment. The disturbances that Cawl referred to as the Ruin Storm had left permanent scars upon the fabric of reality itself, creating regions of space where travel was nearly impossible and where the boundaries between the material and immaterial seemed dangerously thin. When the Macragge, his flagship, maintained across 10,000 years by devoted servants who understood that one day their lord might return, finally emerged into real space above Macragge, Guilliman was confronted with the full visual reality of what had transpired during his absence. The world hung before him like a memorial to lost glory, bearing the marks of 10,000 years of continuous warfare, bombardment, and slow degradation. The planetary defences that should have been among the most sophisticated in the Imperium hung dark and derelict in orbit. Entire continents bore the scars of ancient warfare. The great cities that Guilliman remembered had been reduced to ruins, though some showed signs of being slowly reclaimed by the persistent survivors who inhabited them. And yet, even in this degradation, Guilliman perceived evidence of what had endured. The fortress monasteries that he had so carefully established still stood, though diminished and isolated. Ultramar's remaining military forces, though vastly reduced from their former strength, still maintained some semblance of organisation and capability. The 500 worlds, though fractured, had not completely lost the connections that bound them together. It was not the glorious return that Guilliman might have imagined, but it was not total catastrophe either. Something had endured, not what he would have chosen, not what he had hoped would persist, but something nonetheless upon which a new beginning might potentially be constructed. Standing within the bridge of the Macragge, watching the world of his birth rotate slowly beneath him, Guilliman allowed himself to confront the full weight of what he was being asked to undertake. The Imperium was dying. The principles he had articulated were corrupted beyond recognition. The civilization he had attempted to construct was in ruins, and yet there was work to be done. That realization came with the force of absolute certainty. He had been preserved, brought back from the edge of oblivion, not for his own sake, or even for his own redemption, but because somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperium there remained individuals who believed that his presence, his intellect, his vast capability for understanding and organizing complex systems was necessary for the Imperium's survival. Whether they were correct in that assessment remained to be seen. But Guilliman was no longer merely a commander or administrator or military leader. He was a symbol now, whether he desired it or not, a physical incarnation of a hope that transcended mere military or political calculation. The age of the Great Crusade was impossibly far in the past. The long night of 10,000 years had passed, and now, as Guilliman prepared to descend to Macragge's surface and begin the vast work of attempting to salvage something from the ruins of a dying civilization, he was acutely aware that he stood at the threshold of the most challenging period of his entire existence. Everything he had ever accomplished paled in comparison to what now lay before him. And for the first time since his awakening, Roboute Guilliman found himself confronting something that he had rarely experienced even in the darkest moments of the Horus Heresy: genuine doubt about whether any success was even possible. Chapter 11. The Plague, Wars and Mortarion. The invasion came like a pestilence, spreading across the worlds of Ultramar with a speed that transcended mere military logistics. Robert Guilliman stood within the command centre of Macragge, watching as reports flooded in from across the 500 worlds, each communication bearing the unmistakable signature of a single terrible force: Mortarion, his brother. A being that Guilliman had not seen since the closing stages of the Horus Heresy now returned as something far more terrible than mere death could ever render him. The reports were fragmentary and horrifying in their implications. Entire worlds were being struck simultaneously, or nearly so, as though the invasion had been planned with a precision that suggested Mortarion possessed knowledge of Ultramar's layout and defensive capabilities that should have been impossible for him to obtain. The infection that accompanied the invasion was not merely military in nature. It was biological, pathogenic, a plague that transformed not merely the soldiers defending against it, but the very worlds themselves into something corrupted and twisted beyond recognition. Guilliman's enhanced mind moved through the military calculations with perfect precision, assessing available forces, calculating optimal response strategies, determining which worlds could be defended and which would need to be sacrificed. But beneath the logical analysis, something deeper stirred, a recognition of betrayal, a realization that one of the beings he had once called brother had become something so fundamentally alien that communication was no longer possible. The Plague Wars, as they would later be known, consumed the next several years of Guilliman's existence in ways that transcended mere military campaign. This was not combat against an enemy with comprehensible motivations or conventional military objectives. Mortarion's invasion was driven by something far more alien and terrible, a desire to corrupt, to infect, to transform the very fabric of Ultramar's civilization into something that served the purposes of the Chaos Gods that had claimed him as their servant. The Death Guard, Mortarion's legion, had been transformed across the 10,000 years of Guilliman's stasis into something that transcended ordinary space marines. They were bloated with corruption, their armor fused with their diseased flesh, their very presence a vector for contagion that could transform human populations into something monstrous and wrong. And leading them was Mortarion himself, no longer fully a being of flesh but something far more terrible, a demon prince, a creature of such vast power that Guilliman recognized immediately that conventional military tactics would prove inadequate to the challenge of confronting him directly. The strategic response that Guilliman implemented was grounded in principles he had developed across centuries of military experience. He could not defeat Mortarion through frontal assault. The Demon Prince's power was too vast, his resilience too extreme, but he could contain the infection. He could establish quarantine zones. He could systematically destroy infected worlds before the corruption could spread further, sacrificing populations to save the remainder of Ultramar from complete annihilation. It was the cruelest calculus that command could demand, the necessity of ordering the destruction of entire civilizations to prevent even worse catastrophe. Guilliman issued the orders with the calm precision that he brought to all aspects of military decision-making, but the weight of those decisions, the knowledge of the countless billions who would die as a result of his strategic choices, pressed down upon him with a weight that transcended mere administrative burden. Captain Havelock had passed into death centuries before Guilliman's resurrection. His consciousness long since departed into whatever realm awaited those who had served the Imperium with devotion and honour. But among Guilliman's new officers, he found individuals who possessed the capacity to understand the terrible necessities that command sometimes demanded. Cadia Falchion was one such individual, a commander of extraordinary capability who had spent her entire life studying the Codex Astartes and attempting to understand the principles that Guilliman had articulated. "The world of Espander will be our primary stronghold," Guilliman explained to his gathered commanders, pointing to the tactical display that showed Ultramar's remaining defensive positions. "The manufacturing capacity there remains the strongest of any world in the realm. If we can hold Espandor and establish it as a hub of coordinated military response, we can potentially organise a defence-in-depth strategy that might allow us to contain Mortarian's advance while we work toward a more permanent solution." But the analysis suggested that even Espandor could not be held indefinitely if Mortarion committed his full force to its conquest. The question that demanded answering was whether Guilliman possessed sufficient understanding of his corrupted brother to predict his movements, to anticipate what Mortarion would do when confronted with the reality of facing Guilliman himself in direct opposition. The Plague Wars evolved through distinct phases, each marked by new waves of Death Guard assault and new variations on the biological warfare that characterized Mortarion's invasion. The initial phase saw dozens of worlds fall, their populations either destroyed or transformed into corrupted servitors of chaos. Guilliman systematically organized the evacuation of populations from worlds deemed unable to be held, a massive refugee operation that stretched the resources and logistics of Ultramar's surviving military forces to their breaking point. The second phase involved the establishment of fortified positions and the systematic purging of infected worlds. Guilliman authorized the use of weapons that even he found abhorrent, orbital strikes that annihilated entire population centers in order to prevent the spread of Mortarion's plague. Each such strike represented a failure of his military strategy, an admission that he could not save populations that had placed their trust in the Ultramarines' protection. But the third phase represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. Guilliman, having studied the patterns of Mortarion's assault, began to perceive something within the Demon Prince's strategy that suggested a vulnerability. Mortarion was not simply attempting to conquer Ultramar and incorporate it into his domain. He was actively seeking direct confrontation with Guilliman himself, using the invasion as bait to draw the Lord Commander of Ultramar into a confrontation that he apparently believed would result in Guilliman's destruction, or corruption. It was a realization that crystallized during long hours of strategic analysis, as Guilliman reviewed the patterns of Mortarion's movements and began to perceive the underlying structure beneath what had seemed like chaotic assault. His brother was not merely a military commander engaging in conquest. He was a being driven by something far more primal, a desire for vengeance, for the humiliation and destruction of a being who had thwarted him during the chaos of the Horus Heresy. The realization brought with it a kind of terrible clarity. This conflict could only end in one of two ways, either with Guilliman's defeat and Ultramar's corruption into a realm of chaos, or with the establishment of some form of stalemate that would prevent either of them from achieving absolute victory. A complete triumph over Mortarion was likely impossible, given the Demon Prince's vast power. But perhaps, Guilliman thought, he could achieve something else. He could achieve containment. He could prevent Mortarion from expanding beyond certain boundaries, and in doing so, he might preserve something of Ultramar for future generations. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place on the world of Eax, a world that Guilliman had designated as a hospital world, a place where the surviving populations of devastated worlds could be treated and integrated into Ultramar's fragmentary civilization. The choice of location was not coincidental. By forcing Mortarion to confront him in a place of healing rather than in a fortress designed for war, Guilliman was making a statement about the fundamental nature of their conflict. The image that confronted Guilliman as he advanced toward the meeting place was almost incomprehensible in its wrongness. Mortarion had once been a being of human proportions, augmented and enhanced but recognizably within the spectrum of superhuman capability. Now he was something far larger and more terrible, a mass of corrupted flesh and armor fused together, his form shifting and undulating as though unable to maintain stable shape within the boundaries of normal reality. When Mortarion spoke, His voice carried harmonics that transcended mere sound, resonating through dimensions that Guilliman could perceive but not fully comprehend. "Brother," the Demon Prince said, and the word was filled with mockery and something that might have been pain. "You wake at last, drawn from stasis by forces that did not understand what they were awakening. Did you sleep well, Roboute? Did your dreams preserve your precious principles? Did you imagine that 10,000 years of slumber would somehow make the Imperium into the vision you constructed?" Guilliman steadied himself, calling upon reserves of discipline developed across centuries of command to maintain his composure in the face of a being whose very existence challenged the normal parameters of physical reality. "I did not imagine that the Imperium would remain static," he replied, his voice carrying a measured quality despite the vastness of the moment. "Change was always inevitable, but I hoped that the principles I established would prove resilient enough to guide humanity towards something approaching stability and dignity." Mortarian's laughter was a sound like the screaming of dying worlds. "Stability? Dignity? You built structures designed to constrain power, to prevent any individual from accumulating the capability to reshape civilization according to their vision. And for 10,000 years those structures held. And look what resulted. Stagnation, decay, the slow death of human achievement. I have been offered something far greater, brother. I have been offered the opportunity to transcend the limitations that you and the Emperor sought to impose upon us." The words contained a truth that Guilliman could not entirely deny. The Imperium that he had returned to find was indeed in many ways stagnant, bound by religious doctrine that prevented growth and progress. But the alternative that Mortarion represented, the transformation of human civilization into something serving chaos, was infinitely worse than stagnation. The battle that followed was not a clean affair of strategic maneuver and tactical advantage. It was something far more fundamental, a collision between two beings whose understanding of warfare and strategy had been shaped by centuries of experience, now confronted with an opponent whose very nature transcended normal parameters of combat. Guilliman fought with the precision and focus that had characterized all of his engagements throughout his existence. But Mortarion, drawing upon power granted by the Chaos Gods themselves, transcended conventional limitations of durability and strength. For every wound that Guilliman inflicted upon his corrupted brother, Mortarion seemed able to regenerate, to transform injury into something that only increased his terrible power. The conflict raged across the medical facilities of Ajax, destroying the infrastructure that Guilliman had so carefully established to heal the survivors of Mortarion's plague. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The tide did not turn toward Guilliman's victory. Such a thing was clearly impossible against a being of Mortarion's power. But it shifted toward something else, toward stalemate, toward a recognition that neither of them could achieve absolute victory over the other. In a moment of clarity that emerged from the depths of the combat, Guilliman perceived something within Mortarion's attacks that he recognized as pain. Not physical agony, but something deeper. A spiritual anguish arising from the knowledge of what he had become, from the recognition that the being he had once been was now buried so deeply beneath layers of corruption that retrieval was impossible. "Brother," Guilliman said, his voice cutting through the chaos of combat, "it is not too late. The Emperor still lives. The Imperium still stands. There might yet be a path toward redemption." The suggestion was met with laughter that carried notes of genuine madness. "Redemption? There is no redemption for me, Roboute, and there is none for you either, though you do not yet realize it. We are both creatures of an age that has passed. The Imperium that the Emperor built could not survive. It was always doomed to fail. At least I have accepted that reality." The withdrawal, when it came, was not a retreat in the conventional sense. Mortarion simply ceased pressing his attack, stepping back from Guilliman with a movement that suggested a being making a deliberate choice rather than one forced to flee. The Demon Prince's corrupted form began to dissolve, phasing back toward the warp through mechanisms that Guilliman could perceive but not prevent. "I will leave Ultramar," Mortarion said as his form began to dissipate, "but not because you have defeated me. I leave because my purpose here is fulfilled. I have shown you what I have become, and I will leave behind remnants of my plague, seeds of corruption that will fester within your realm for all the years to come. You have not saved Ultramar, brother. You have merely preserved its corpse, a thing that will slowly rot from within." The words hung in the air even after Mortarian's physical form had vanished. A prophecy and a curse combined, a statement of absolute certainty that whatever Guilliman accomplished in Ultramar, it would always be fundamentally compromised by the corruption that had been introduced into its very foundation. In the aftermath of the confrontation, surrounded by the ruins of Ajax's medical facilities, Guilliman allowed himself a moment of something approaching despair. He had held Ultramar. He had prevented Mortarion from achieving total conquest of the realm. But the cost had been almost incomprehensible. Dozens of worlds had been rendered uninhabitable, trillions of lives had been lost, and the corruption that Mortarion had introduced would indeed fester within Ultramar, creating problems and challenges that would persist for millennia. Yet standing in those ruins, Guilliman made a choice. He would not allow Mortarion's final words to define his purpose. Yes, Ultramar would be forever marked by the Plague Wars. Yes, the corruption would persist, but corruption could be contained, damage could be repaired, and from the ashes of devastation something new could be built. Cadia Falchion appeared beside him, her armour bearing the marks of fierce combat, her face showing exhaustion, but also a kind of grim determination. "The Plague Wars are over, my lord," she said quietly. "We have held. It is not the victory we sought, but it is survival." "Survival," Guilliman repeated, the word carrying a weight that transcended its simple meaning. "For now, that must be sufficient. We have much work to do." And turning toward the stars, Guilliman began to contemplate the vast challenges that still lay before him. The reconstruction of Ultramar, the broader crisis facing the Imperium, and the terrible knowledge that even in victory something essential had been lost and could never be fully recovered. Chapter 12. The Lord Commander's Burden. The throne room of the Imperial Palace on Terra was a place of overwhelming grandeur and profound emptiness, a space constructed to convey absolute power and authority, yet somehow conveying instead a sense of desperate, futile defiance against the encroaching darkness. Robert Guilliman stood within that vast chamber, feeling the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated responsibility settle upon his shoulders like the pressure of the void itself. Before him sat the High Lords of Terra, representatives of the Imperium's various power structures, their faces bearing expressions that range from hope to barely concealed skepticism at the presence of this being resurrected from the distant past. The journey to Terra had consumed months of careful navigation through the warp, following routes that had been painstakingly mapped during the 10,000 years of Guilliman's absence. The voyage itself had been harrowing, confronting him with the reality that space travel in the current age was neither swift nor reliable, that the vast distances separating human worlds had grown somehow greater and more hostile despite humanity's best efforts to maintain the infrastructure that made such travel possible. But he had arrived, and his arrival had sent shockwaves through the Imperium far more profound than any military victory could have generated. A Primarch had returned, not merely a figure from history, but an actual living Primarch, walking and breathing and speaking with an authority that transcended mere political position. The Emperor, Guilliman had learned, remained upon the Golden Throne, sustained by mechanisms that no one fully understood, existing in a state that transcended conventional life and death. Communication with his vast consciousness was possible, but difficult and unreliable, filtered through systems so complex that even the Adeptus Mechanicus, the keepers of ancient technology, admitted to only partial comprehension of how they functioned. But in those moments when communication could be established, Guilliman had perceived something within the Emperor's vast consciousness that carried weight and significance. The Emperor's awareness remained active, his intelligence still functioning on a level that transcended even the vast capability that even the Primarchs possessed. And there was something in his communication, some subtle indication, that suggested he had been aware of the possibility of Guilliman's eventual resurrection, had perhaps even anticipated it. The High Lords before him were a study in contrasts and conflicting interests. There was the master of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a being so merged with technology that determining where machine ended and human began had become a meaningless question. There were military commanders who had spent their entire careers maintaining the vast military apparatus required to keep the Imperium's scattered worlds united. There were representatives of the ecclesiarchy, whose religious authority had become so extensive that their power transcended mere spiritual guidance and extended into fundamental control of how the Imperium's population understood reality itself. And standing apart from all of them, a figure whose presence carried implications that Guilliman was still working to fully comprehend, was Saint Celestine. She was ancient beyond measure, yet her form seemed to transcend the normal limitations of age and decay. Her eyes held a luminosity that suggested connection to something far greater than mere human consciousness. And her bearing suggested an authority that derived not from institutional position, but from something deeper and far more primal. Lord Commander, the master of the Adeptus Mechanicus, began, his voice emerging from vocalizers integrated into his augmented form. We are honoured by your presence and grateful for your willingness to assume a position of leadership within our fractured Imperium. However, there are certain matters that require discussion before we can fully establish your authority and integrate your vision with the existing structures of Imperial governance. Guilliman nodded slowly, understanding the political necessity of such preliminary negotiations, even as he found himself impatient with the bureaucratic formalities that human governance seemed to require even in the face of existential crisis. "Speak freely," he replied, his voice carrying a tone that managed to be both welcoming and unmistakably authoritative. "The issue of the religious authority of the ecclesiarchy is a primary concern," the Mechanicus representative continued. "The Emperor is worshipped as a god by the vast majority of the Imperium's population. This belief system, while certainly not what your initial teachings emphasized, has become so deeply embedded in human consciousness that any attempt to challenge it directly would likely result in catastrophic social upheaval." A representative of the ecclesiarchy rose, her ornate robes bearing the symbols of her exalted position. "The Emperor has become divine," she declared, her voice carrying the fervour of absolute conviction. Whether or not this was the original intention, it is now the reality that animates human civilization. To suggest otherwise would be to attack the very foundation upon which billions of faithful souls base their understanding of existence and purpose. Guilliman considered the implications of what was being conveyed to him. The Imperium had been fundamentally transformed during his absence. The rational principles that he had attempted to ground it in had been overwritten by religious doctrine that served many of the same functions, but through mechanisms of faith rather than logic. His own teachings, carefully articulated to prevent exactly this kind of mythologization, had themselves been incorporated into religious tradition and reinterpreted in ways that bore only superficial resemblance to what he had originally intended. It was a realization that brought with it a kind of grim resignation. He could not, he understood, simply overturn 10,000 years of religious tradition. The Imperium's population had been shaped by that tradition. Their entire worldview, their understanding of morality and duty and the proper ordering of civilization had been constructed around religious principles that transcended rational analysis. "I do not come to destroy your faith," Guilliman said carefully, choosing his words with the precision that had characterized all of his communications throughout his life. "I come to serve the Imperium and the Emperor, just as I did 10,000 years ago. If your faith serves the purpose of maintaining order and encouraging the population to behave according to principles of duty and sacrifice, then perhaps it serves functions that are not entirely without merit, regardless of whether it accords perfectly with rational principles." The statement was met with visible relief from multiple quarters, though Guilliman perceived in St. Celestine's eyes a suggestion that she understood his words carried deeper implications than their surface meaning suggested. She knew, he realized, that he was making a strategic choice rather than a philosophical capitulation, that he was accepting the reality of the Imperium's current state, while preserving the possibility of gradual transformation in future generations. "But there are other matters," a military commander interjected, a scarred woman whose bearing suggested decades spent in actual combat rather than in political maneuvering. "The state of the Imperium's military forces is dire. We face threats from multiple directions. Chaos forces continue to assault our borders, Xenos civilizations press against our territories, and there are indications of internal instability in several sectors. The High Lords, have been managing these crises, but our resources are stretched beyond the breaking point." Guilliman nodded, understanding immediately the scope of the challenge being outlined. The Imperium was not merely declining, not merely stagnating. It was actively being assaulted by multiple foes, all of whom possessed the capability to inflict severe damage if they coordinated their efforts effectively. The miracle was not that the Imperium had persisted for 10,000 years, but that it had managed to persist at all despite such overwhelming pressure. "I will need comprehensive briefings on the current state of military forces in each sector," Guilliman said, his mind already beginning to move through the vast calculations that such analysis would require. "I will need access to whatever intelligence exists regarding enemy capabilities and intentions, and I will need the authority to implement reforms in military organisation and strategy." The request sparked considerable debate among the assembled High Lords. Some supported it enthusiastically, seeing in Guilliman the hope of military salvation they had been seeking for centuries. Others were more cautious, concerned about the implications of granting such extensive authority to a single individual, aware that such concentration of power had been the underlying cause of the Horus Heresy itself. But it was Saint Celestine who broke the impasse. "The Emperor wills this," she declared, and her voice carried such certainty that no one in the chamber dared challenge her statement. Whether or not that claim was literally true, the effect was to shift the political reality decisively in Guilliman's favour. If the divine will of the Emperor supported his assumption of broad authority, then opposition became heresy. In the months that followed his arrival at Terra, Guilliman immersed himself in the vast administrative machinery of the Imperium's government. He reviewed reports that detailed the staggering complexity of maintaining a civilization spread across hundreds of thousands of worlds. He studied the state of military forces, assessing their capabilities and identifying the fundamental deficiencies that had allowed the Imperium to decline so dramatically. What he discovered was both deeply troubling and, in a strange way, reassuring. The Imperium was dying, yes, but it was not yet dead. Pockets of genuine excellence persisted within the broader degradation. The Adeptus Mechanicus, despite their religious adherence to preserving pre-heresy technology, maintained a commitment to the preservation and maintenance of that technology that suggested they understood its fundamental importance. The Space Marine chapters, distributed across human space, maintained discipline and capability that exceeded what Guilliman would have anticipated given the general state of Imperial decline. And most importantly, there existed individuals throughout the Imperium who understood that change was necessary, who preserved knowledge of Guilliman's original teachings, who had maintained hope that one day the Primarch might return to guide them toward a future less desperate than the present. The reforms that Guilliman began to implement were necessarily gradual, undertaken with careful attention to the political realities that governed the Imperium's complex power structures. He could not simply overturn 10,000 years of tradition, but he could begin to introduce changes at the margins, could position individuals who shared his vision in places of authority, could begin the slow work of transforming institutions from within rather than attempting to rebuild them from scratch. Most significantly, he established the Indomitus Crusade, a vast military campaign designed not merely to defend the Imperium's existing territories, but to begin reclaiming worlds that had fallen to chaos or been isolated from human contact for millennia. The crusade was undertaken with careful attention to the lessons he had learned across his entire existence, military strength combined with diplomatic efforts designed to integrate reclaimed worlds into the broader Imperium rather than simply conquering them. The response to his assumption of leadership was profoundly mixed. In some sectors, his return was celebrated as the answer to prayers and the hope for salvation. But in others, particularly those controlled by factions that had accumulated significant power during the centuries of the Imperium's decline, his presence represented a threat to established authority. Standing in his personal chamber aboard the Macragge, suspended in orbit above Terra, Guilliman contemplated the immensity of the task that lay before him. He could devote the remainder of his existence to the work of restoration and reconstruction, and the Imperium would likely still be in a state of managed decline when his strength finally failed. The damage was too extensive, the inertia too great, the forces arrayed against human civilization too powerful. And yet, there was work to be done. There were worlds that could be saved. There were populations that could be elevated from barbarism back towards civilization. There were pockets of excellence that could be expanded and strengthened. And most importantly, there existed the possibility, however distant, that the Imperium might eventually stabilize and even begin to recover some of what had been lost. The message from the Emperor came through in the early hours of a standard day cycle, transmitted through the mechanisms of the Golden Throne in a way that suggested direct communication rather than filtered intermediary. The words were simple, yet they carried weight that seemed to transcend their literal meaning. "My son," the Emperor's consciousness conveyed, "you have borne burdens that no being should be required to carry. You have sacrificed more than any individual should be asked to sacrifice, but the work continues, and it requires your presence and your guidance. The Imperium is dying, yes, but death is not inevitable. It is merely the most likely outcome given current circumstances. Change that calculus. Prove that salvation is possible." It was perhaps the most direct communication that Guilliman had received from the Emperor since his resurrection, and its implications were profound. The Emperor was aware of the challenges that Guilliman faced, and more than that, he was granting what amounted to permission for Guilliman to pursue his vision without the constraint of needing to conform perfectly to traditional Imperial structures and procedures. The decision crystallized in Guilliman's consciousness with terrible clarity. He would remain. He would devote himself to the work of attempting to salvage something from the ruins of a dying civilization, not because success was guaranteed, not because the task was even likely to be accomplished, but because the attempt itself had value, because bearing burdens with dignity and purpose was perhaps the highest calling that any being could aspire to. Looking out at Terra, at the sprawling complexity of human civilization stretched across a single world and reaching out across hundreds of thousands of others, Guilliman understood that he was facing a future that would be defined by constant crisis, by the necessity of making impossible choices, by the weight of responsibility that could never be fully set down. It was not the triumph he had envisioned during the golden age of the Great Crusade. It was something far more difficult and far more important. The daily, unglamorous work of trying to prevent an entire civilization from collapsing into darkness and despair. The Indomitus Crusade would continue for years beyond counting. The work of reform and reconstruction would consume the remainder of his existence, and there would be moments of profound doubt, instances when the futility of the effort seemed almost unbearable. But there would also be moments of genuine accomplishment, instances where human worlds reclaimed from ruin could once again produce art and science, where populations could be restored to dignity and purpose. And in those moments, standing at the threshold between the dying Imperium and whatever future might be constructed from its ashes, Robert Guilliman would carry forward the burden of command with the same precision and dedication that had characterized his entire existence. The long night was ending, not because salvation was assured, but because there remained beings willing to work toward it despite the overwhelming odds arrayed against them. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where civilizations rose and fell like waves upon a shore, sometimes that simple act of defiant determination was the greatest achievement that any being could accomplish. The Lord Commander stood at his window watching the stars stretch out before him in infinite profusion and prepared himself for the work that awaited. The burden was immense, but he had borne burdens before, and he would bear them again, for as long as strength remained and purpose could be found in the struggle itself. The future remained uncertain, but Robert Guilliman would face it with the same calm resolve that had defined him across 10,000 years of existence. Not with the certainty of victory, but with the absolute commitment to attempt it nonetheless. And that perhaps was all that could be asked of any being, no matter how great their power or how vast their capability.